Welcome back, my family. Before we dive into tonight's creepy little journey, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves a good scare before bed. I would love to know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. So drop it down in the comments and hype me up a little on YouTube. Now, get comfortable, dim the lights, and let us step into tonight's story. Rain tapped the glass in slow, sleepy rhythms, while my thumb traced the worn edge of the front desk. One of those tiny habits you pick up when you work nights and the world forgets you exist. The lobby felt warm in a thin, artificial way. Stale coffee, lemon cleaner, and the steady hum of the heater trying its best to keep the darkness outside. Across the parking lot, the vacancy sign buzzed and blinked red over the wet pavement like a heartbeat you could see, neon trembling in every puddle. For a moment, it was almost soothing. Then the phone rang. One ring, sharp, clinical, too loud for a place this quiet. I lifted the receiver and heard nothing at first but breathing. Slow and close, as if the caller was standing right beside the glass doors. I forced my voice into that practice calm. Red Cedar Motor Lodge. How can I help you? A pause. The breathing didn't change. Then a voice, gentle, almost polite, whispered, "I'm here." I looked up. The parking lot was empty. No headlights, no figures, no movement. Only rain sliding down the glass and neon shivering in the dark. My grip tightened on the receiver because the voice hadn't sounded like it was coming from a phone line. It sounded like it was coming from inside the building. And that's when the receipt printer behind the counter gave a soft, confident beep, like it had just recognized someone. I'm going to tell you what happened over the next few hours as calmly as I can, because it still doesn't sound real when I say it out loud. Names and a few identifying details have been changed for privacy, but every moment you're about to hear is exactly how it felt from my side of the counter. Quiet, ordinary, until it wasn't. If you like slow burn stories that stay with you long after the lights are out, you can subscribe now and just let the rest of this play in the background. Either way, settle in. Because that night at the motel taught me something I wish I'd learned anywhere else. Sometimes, a place doesn't need you to open the door to get inside. I'm going to change names and a few small details, not because the story needs extra mystery, but because there are still people in that town who would recognize the place if I described it too cleanly. What matters is how it felt from behind the front desk. The kind of ordinary that slowly, quietly becomes something else. The motel sat just far enough off the highway that you could still hear the traffic, but it arrived softened and delayed, like waves breaking somewhere beyond a wall. A handful of sodium lights leaned over the parking lot, turning the rain-slick asphalt into black glass. Every puddle held a trembling reflection of the red vacancy sign, which buzzed as it blinked. Steady, stubborn, slightly exhausted, like it had been awake for years and couldn't quite remember how to sleep. When the wind pushed, the sign's metal frame shivered, and the sound carried through the lobby windows in a faint electric rasp. It should have been annoying. At night, it was almost comforting. Anything rhythmic is, when you're alone long enough. Inside, the lobby had that particular motel smell that never fully leaves. Lemon cleaner over old carpet, stale coffee hiding in the corners, and the faint mineral bite of dampness that always returns after the first hard rain of late fall. A soft orange lamp sat by the brochure rack, the kind of warm light that forgives everything it touches. Beneath it, faded tourist pamphlets fanned out in plastic pockets. Caverns, museums, a winery that had probably closed, a historic downtown that was 3 blocks and a statue. Dust hung in the air, visible only when you leaned into the lamp's glow. Behind the counter, the register monitor washed my hands in pale blue light, while the rest of the lobby stayed in amber shadow, like 2 different rooms stitched together. Night audit is mostly routine and small kindnesses. People imagine it's dramatic. Angry guests, emergencies, cops. Most nights, it's a man in sweatpants asking for extra towels, or a woman who needs directions at 2 a.m. because her GPS died. The dramatic part is the stillness. The building settles. The world goes quiet enough that every little sound starts to mean something, even when it doesn't. The heater under the counter kicked on in cycles, each time with a dull thump from somewhere in the wall, a heavy, familiar punctuation. When the fan started, it filled the lobby with a gentle, steady hum that made the quiet feel less sharp. Overhead, the fluorescent fixtures didn't exactly flicker, but they buzzed softly, a thin electric whine you stopped noticing until it paused for half a second and your skin remembered it was there. Every so often, the ice machine down the hall would grind out a fresh batch, the motor catching and releasing in a way that always sounded like teeth. If you've ever stood alone in a dark building and heard a machine do something human, you'll know what I mean. The sound wasn't loud, just intimate, too close to silence. I did my normal checks. I walked behind the desk, logged into the property system, counted the cash drawer twice the way my manager insisted, and wrote the number down in a spiral notebook with a pen that barely worked. I refreshed the reservation list, cleared a couple of pending charges, printed the audit reports I would hand to the morning shift like a peace offering. Outside, the rain tapped the glass in uneven patterns, sometimes fast and busy, sometimes slow, almost sleepy, depending on how the wind shifted. It was the kind of night that makes you feel drowsy in your bones, even if you've had too much caffeine and you're trying to keep your eyes open. Between tasks, I watched the security monitors, 6 feeds in a neat grid, the lobby entrance, the 2 main hallways, the stairwell, the laundry room, and a wide shot of the parking lot. The cameras weren't great, grainy, a little dark at the edges, so the world on those screens always looked a step removed, like it belonged to somebody else. In the parking lot feed, the rain made the pavement shimmer. In hallway A, the carpet's pattern broke into soft static. Hallway B looked emptier than it should, the far end fading into shadow where the vending machines were. Every few minutes I'd glance up, mostly out of habit, and the quiet images would reassure me. Still empty, still normal. Around midnight, when the last guest had long since closed their door, the building took on that deep motel quiet that feels like it has weight. It was calm enough that my shoulders finally loosened. I traced the worn edge of the front desk with my thumb, another habit I didn't realize I had until I noticed the groove in the laminate where so many hands had done the same thing. My coffee sat near the keyboard, cooling into bitterness. The orange lamp made everything look gentle, like the lobby was trying to be a safe place for whoever wandered in next. That's when the soundscape did what it always does, right before something changes. It left a small gap. The heater clicked off. The fluorescent buzz seemed to thin. Even the rain softened for a breath. I remember it because my body registered the pause before my mind did. the way you sometimes wake up seconds before an alarm. And in that small pocket of almost silence, the receipt printer behind the counter gave a single, confident beep, clean and certain, like someone had just checked in, even though my hands weren't on the keyboard. For a second, I didn't move. My eyes stayed on the monitors, as if one of the little screens would explain the sound for me. The receipt printer sat to my right, tucked beside the keyboard like an obedient appliance, its mouth facing out toward the lobby. It was the kind of small thermal printer that never looks impressive until you realize how much power it has over your life. Every transaction, every checkout, every paper trail that says who was here and when. Another soft noise followed the beep, the faint, rapid chatter of the thermal head moving, a dry little zzz, zzz, zzz that sounded like an insect rubbing its legs. A thin strip of paper began to curl out of the slot. I turned slowly in my chair. The paper was bright white against the dim lobby, the curl catching the orange lamplight so it looked almost warm. It kept feeding, inch by inch, until the printer paused with a final tiny click, as if satisfied. I stared at the receipt like it might be a prank. It's strange how quickly your mind reaches for normal explanations, even when your body is telling you not to. I told myself I must have brushed a key by accident, or the system had been buffering something from earlier, or the day shift had left a print job in the queue. We used ancient property management software, one of those beige, clunky systems that looked like it had been designed for Windows 98 and never updated because it technically still worked. It was the sort of program that could lose a reservation if you stared at it too hard. I reached out and pinched the paper between my fingers. It was warm. Not fresh from a sunny window. Warm. More like the warmth of something that had just been alive for a moment. The kind of heat that makes you aware of your own skin. I pulled gently. The receipt tore free with that familiar thermal paper sound. Soft, waxy, almost damp even when it's dry. The print was crisp and dark. Room, 28 rate, $59.99. Guest, Elias Morrow. Date, Nov. 3, 2004. I read it once, then again, slower, as if changing the pace would change the words. The numbers didn't blur. The letters didn't smear. The date sat there at the bottom, like a punchline nobody had told. A small pressure built behind my eyes. It wasn't full fear yet. More like disbelief, struggling to organize itself. My first thought was absurdly mundane. Maybe the system had defaulted to an old template. Or maybe the printer had cached something from years ago and decided now was a good time to spit it out. A ghost job, I thought, because that's what I'd heard older IT guys call it when a printer mysteriously reprinted something hours later. But 2004 wasn't hours ago. I glanced at the corner of the computer screen where the system clock sat in tiny digits. Then I checked my phone just to be sure, because suddenly I didn't trust anything in that building that could display a date. Both said the same thing. The present, clean and indifferent. My hands started to sweat against the thermal paper. The receipt felt too light to be carrying that much wrongness. I tried to reproduce it. I tapped the keyboard, the keys clicking sharply in the quiet. I opened the reservation screen, searched for Morrow. Nothing. I searched for Elias. Nothing. I pulled up the room status grid and found room 28 highlighted in that dull gray the system used for out of order. It had been that way long enough that my eyes barely registered it most nights. Room 28 wasn't the kind of thing you forgot. It sat at the far end of hallway B, right near the vending machines where the carpet never fully dried. Guests had complained about it in a way that sounded almost embarrassed, like they didn't want to be the kind of person who complained about a room having a feeling. One guy said it smelled like wet pennies, and I'd laughed at the specificity until I went in there myself and realized he'd nailed it. Not blood, not rust exactly, just that coppery metallic scent that sits at the back of your throat and makes you swallow. Another guest had reported scratching sounds behind the headboard. We'd sent maintenance. They found nothing but a stain spreading under the wallpaper like an old bruise. My manager called it mildew, shrugged, and put the room out of service until we had time to fix it. We never did. We just kept the door closed, taped an out-of-order sign to it, and acted like that was the same as solving a problem. Even thinking about the room made the air in the lobby feel colder. I set the receipt on the counter and listened. The building kept its usual noises, the faint buzz of fluorescence, the distant rush of water in a pipe, the rain tapping the glass in shifting rhythms. Nothing screamed. Nothing moved on the monitors. Hallway B was empty in its grainy frame, the vending machines dark blocks at the far end. The old desktop computer under the counter exhaled a tired fan whine, a constant low breath that suddenly felt louder, like it was trying to cover for the printer's mistake. I clicked through menus, trying to find any sign of a transaction that matched what had printed. The mouse made small plastic ticks. The keyboard clacked. The system lagged the way it always did, stubbornly slow, making me wait for each screen like a punishment. No record, no Elias Morrow, no check-in. Just that receipt, warm and real and wrong. I should tell you, at this point, I wasn't thinking about ghosts. I wasn't thinking about curses or time loops or any of the things people want to believe in because they make the world feel more interesting. I was thinking about the day shift messing something up. I was thinking about how my manager would blame me. I was thinking about paper jams and software updates and the half-broken printer driver that needed restarting every few weeks. Fear, when it starts, often wears the mask of irritation. So I did what tired people do when something doesn't make immediate sense. I tried to file it away. I folded the receipt in half, then in half again, and slipped it into my pocket like it was just another scrap of paper I'd deal with later. I told myself I'd mention it in the morning. I told myself it was a glitch, an echo, a leftover print job crawling out of the machine's memory. I told myself it didn't matter, because nobody named Elias Morrow was standing in the lobby, and room 28 was out of order, and that was that. I sat back down. I took a sip of my coffee and made a face at how bitter it had become. I refreshed the monitors again, more for comfort than necessity. The parking lot was still empty. The lobby entrance feed showed nothing but rain reflections and the trembling glow of neon. The heater clicked on again with its dull thump, filling the lobby with warm hum. My shoulders loosened, just a little. And then the lobby phone rang. The ring was crisp and sharp, too clean for the quiet, like a scalpel slicing through fabric, and it sounded impossibly loud in the warm, sleepy hum of the building. The third ring held on a fraction longer than the first two, crisp and clinical, as if whoever or whatever was on the other end had finally decided to commit. I picked up the receiver with my palm damp against the plastic and forced my voice into its usual shape, the one I used for late-night guests who were tired, lost, or slightly drunk. "Red Cedar Motor Lodge," I said. "Front desk." For a beat, There was nothing but a faint hiss, the kind of line noise you hear on old calls, and then breathing, slow and close. Not ragged, not panicked, just present, like someone standing in a dark room trying not to move. The voice that followed was calm in a way that made my skin tighten. Low, smooth, almost courteous. "I have a reservation," it said. The words weren't threatening, and that was part of what made them unsettling. They landed too neatly in the quiet. "All right," I replied, keeping my tone steady. My eyes flicked to the computer screen as my fingers hovered above the keyboard, ready to search the system again and prove to myself this was normal. "What name is it under?" Another small pause, as if the caller was listening for something behind the line, like the building itself. Then the voice said, very clearly, "Elias Morrow." The name hit me the way a cold drop hits warm skin. My throat tightened before I could stop it. I felt the folded receipt in my pocket like a physical weight. And for a moment, I was aware of every sound in the lobby at once. The old PC fan exhaling its steady breath, the fluorescent buzz just above hearing, the rain ticking the glass in uneven taps. My fingers moved anyway, searching the reservation list, because routine is a life raft. "I'm not seeing that," I said carefully, as if I were dealing with a billing error and not a name that shouldn't exist. "Did you book online or—" "I'm here," the voice interrupted, gentle and matter of fact. I looked up at the glass doors. Rain slid down them in pale threads, and beyond the threshold, the parking lot sat empty under the sodium lights, black and glossy like spilled oil. No headlights. No silhouettes moving between cars. No shape approaching through the curtain of rain. Just the buzzing red vacancy sign reflected in puddles, blinking like a slow pulse. I swallowed. "Sir," I said, and hated how small the word sounded in the receiver. "I don't see anyone at the entrance." The line hissed softly, and the voice replied with the same calm, as if my statement had been a minor misunderstanding. "Look at your monitors." The request was so specific, so casual, that my body reacted before my mind could argue. My eyes snapped to the security screens. Lobby entrance, hallway, A, hallway, B, stairs, laundry, parking lot, everything in its usual grid of grainy rectangles. For a second, it all looked exactly as it had all night. Still, empty, unremarkable. Then the lobby entrance feed stuttered. Not a full glitch, not static, just a tiny skip, like a video buffering for one frame. In that brief hiccup, the reflection in the glass doors on the screen sharpened unnaturally, and I saw a shape behind me, tall, upright, too close to my shoulder. Not a clear face, more like the suggestion of a person-shaped shadow wearing the lobby's dim light-like clothing. The sight punched a jolt of cold through my chest. I whipped around so fast my chair legs scraped the floor. The lobby was empty. No footsteps, no movement, no ripple of air. The orange lamp glowed. The brochure rack leaned in its corner. The coffee pot sat quietly, a dark pool in the glass. The rain kept tapping the windows as if nothing had happened. My heart hammered once, hard enough to feel in my throat. I turned back to the monitors, expecting the shape to be gone. And it was. Just my own vague outline in the glass reflection again. The empty door. The wet lot outside. My skin prickled anyway, as if the image had left an aftertaste. The receiver was still pressed to my ear. The voice was still there, patient, breathing slow. "You saw me," it said, not accusing, just stating a fact. I didn't see anything. I lied automatically, because the words came easier than the truth. I tried to pull air into my lungs without making it sound like fear. If you're outside, you can come to the voice cut in, closer now, the tone barely changing. Room 28, it said. Please. The number made my stomach drop. Of all the rooms it could have requested, of all the normal, available rooms on a Tuesday night, it chose the one that was out of order, the one that smelled like pennies, the one guests said scratched behind the walls. I pictured the gray box on the room grid, the taped sign we'd put up like a bandage, the door at the far end of hallway B where the light felt weaker. That room isn't available, I said, trying to keep my voice in that customer service lane. It's out of service. I can put you in. It's always available, the voice said. And for the first time, there was something else beneath the calm. Something that sounded like certainty, wearing a smile. It's the only one that stays. The heater behind the counter clicked off mid-hum, and the sudden quiet felt like the building holding its breath. I realized my knuckles had gone white around the phone. Who is this? I asked, sharper now. If you're messing with me? A soft exhale came through the line, almost like laughter, but not quite. You already printed it, the voice murmured. You heard the beep. The words slid under my skin because they were true. Because the receipt had printed before the call, before the name was spoken, before anything about this made sense. I could feel the folded paper in my pocket again, like it was warming itself against me. I tried to move the conversation back to something real. I can't check anyone into an out-of-order room, I said. If you're a guest, come to the lobby. If you're not, I'm going to hang up. Another pause. Then the voice said, very softly, don't hang up, like it mattered more than it should. My eyes drifted to the glass doors again, half expecting to see a figure appear at the edge of the rain. Still nothing. The empty lot looked almost staged in its stillness. Too clean, too vacant. The vacancy sign buzzed, blinked, buzzed again. I forced myself to take control of the situation the only way I knew how. Room 28 is not an option, I said, and heard my own voice shake on the last word despite my effort. That's final. For a heartbeat, the line went completely silent. No hiss, no breathing, nothing. Then, in the calmest voice yet, the caller said, okay, just that, as if we'd concluded a simple misunderstanding. And then the call ended, not with a click like a handset being replaced, but with an abrupt deadness, like someone had cut the wire clean in one motion. I lowered the receiver slowly and set it back in the cradle. My hand lingered on it longer than necessary, as if I could feel the call's echo in the plastic. The lobby sounds returned one by one. The fluorescent buzz, the PC fan, the rain. The heater kicked back on with its familiar thump, trying to make everything feel normal again. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty glass doors and the quiet monitors, waiting for my heartbeat to settle into something reasonable. It didn't. Instead, my mind kept circling the same two facts like a tongue worrying a sore tooth. 1. The receipt had printed with Elias Morrow's name before anyone spoke it. 2. The monitor had shown a shape behind me that the lobby itself refused to contain. That was the moment the prank explanation died, not all at once, but like a light slowly fading in a room you can't leave. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the folded receipt, and unfolded it again under the orange lamp. The ink looked as crisp as ever. Room 28. Elias Morrow, November 3rd, 2004. The paper felt dry now, but I could still remember the warmth it had carried, when it first slid from the printer, as if it had been pulled from the throat of something alive. I stared at it until my eyes began to sting, then folded it back up with careful fingers and set it on the counter where I could see it. Somewhere down hallway B, faint but distinct, the vending machine made a slow, deliberate clunk. Nothing dropping. No normal mechanical cycle. Just the sound of pressure against buttons in the dark. I didn't move right away. I told myself to stay behind the desk, to call my manager, to do the smart thing. But the sound had already planted an image in my mind. The far end of the hallway, the out-of-order door, and the idea that something had just acknowledged my refusal. I picked up the master key ring from the drawer and felt its cold weight settle into my palm. Then, without fully deciding to, I stepped out from behind the counter and let the lobby's warm light fall away behind me. I didn't announce myself to the empty lobby. I didn't call out into the hallway like a person in a horror movie trying to prove they weren't afraid. I just moved with the quiet efficiency that night shifts teach you. Because routine is what you reach for when the world starts slipping. I went back behind the counter, opened the drawer where we kept the things we pretended were safety, and wrapped my fingers around the master key ring. The metal was cold and heavy, a small, familiar weight that grounded me more than it should have. Next to it sat a flashlight. Cheap plastic, scuffed lens, the kind maintenance used under sinks. The hallways were lit, technically, but I took it anyway. Light in a motel is never a promise. It's a suggestion. The heater hummed behind me again, like it was trying to cover for what had just happened. The fluorescent buzz settled back into its thin, electric whine. From the coffee pot came the faint, bitter smell of something that had been warm and now wasn't. Outside, the rain kept tapping and sliding down the glass, but from inside, it sounded muffled, like the building had wrapped the storm in insulation. I glanced at the security monitors one more time out of habit. The lobby entrance feed showed nothing. Hallway A was still. Hallway B was a long, dim tunnel with the vending machines at the far end, their glass faces reflecting almost no light. Nothing moved. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. I could still see, too clearly, the moment the feed had stuttered and the reflection had sharpened, and that tall shape had stood behind me like it belonged there. The image didn't fade the way other images do. It stayed, hovering at the edge of my vision, as if my brain had filed it under unfinished business. I stepped out from behind the desk. The lobby carpet swallowed my first footfall so completely it felt like stepping onto felt. The warmth of the front room dropped off immediately, not dramatically, but enough to make my skin notice. The orange lamp by the brochures cast a comforting pool of light that ended too quickly, and beyond it, the hallway entrance waited in cooler tones. Above the junction, an exit sign glowed red, brighter than it had any right to be, its letters buzzing faintly in a way you could feel more than hear. The glow painted the peeling wallpaper beneath it in a sickly blush, highlighting small imperfections, a seam that had lifted, a corner that had curled, the dark line of old moisture that no amount of paint could erase. Hallway A ran off to the left, our normal corridor. The carpet there had a busy pattern of browns and faded blues, meant to hide stains, and the room doors were evenly spaced, their numbers straight, their handles dulled by 1,000 hands. That hallway always smelled like laundry detergent and old smoke that had soaked into drywall back when the place still allowed it. It was the kind of smell you stopped noticing until it was gone. Hallway B was to the right, and it always felt like the motel's afterthought. The light fixtures were the same, but they gave off less. The carpet looked darker, not just because of shadows, but because it never fully dried. That was where the vending machines were, where the ice machine did its grinding teeth routine, where room 28 sat at the far end like an avoided topic. I walked anyway. My flashlight stayed pointed down, not because I needed it, but because the small circle of white light gave me something to focus on, something controlled and immediate. The beam slid over the carpet's pattern and made it look like a map of bruises and faded rivers. My steps made almost no sound. The dampness in the fibers absorbed everything, turning my movement into a quiet glide that felt wrong, like I wasn't making enough noise to prove I was real. Overhead, the fluorescent fixtures buzzed, but the sound seemed thinner here, as if the air itself were swallowing it. The rain became more distant, pressed behind walls and glass and insulation until it was just a soft, restless hush. As I passed the laundry room, I caught the scent of detergent and hot metal, and for a moment my mind tried to latch onto it the way it had earlier latched onto coffee and lemon cleaner. Ordinary smells, safe smells. But the further I went, the more another scent threaded into everything. Copper. Not the obvious metallic tang of a cut lip, not the sharpness of blood, but that distinct pennies smell. Wet coinage held too long in a warm hand. It grew slowly, almost politely, like it didn't want to startle me. The air felt cooler with each step, and by the time I reached the point where hallway B began in earnest, the temperature had dropped enough that my forearms prickled. The vending machines at the far end were usually the noisiest things in that corridor. Even when no one used them, they hummed steadily, a low mechanical vibration that filled the space with the suggestion of life. That night, as I approached, I heard the hum, faint but present, like a distant engine idling. It should have been comforting. Instead, it made the quiet behind it feel staged, as if the building were holding certain sounds back and letting others through. I kept walking, keys shifting softly in my grip, metal clicking against metal in small, nervous rhythms. Halfway down hallway B, the hum stopped. Not gradually, not like a compressor cycling off, but as if someone had reached behind the machines and flipped a switch. The vibration vanished. The air changed. Without that background sound, the hallway became too quiet in a way that made my ears strain. I realized I could hear the faintest details now. The soft tick of a light fixture warming, the distant cough of the heater returning to life somewhere behind me, my own breath sliding through my nose. The sudden absence felt less like silence and more like attention, like something had decided to listen. The exit sign at the junction still glowed behind me, but its red light didn't reach this far. Here, the illumination was pale and tired, and the corners of the corridor held on to shadow. The peeling wallpaper looked worse up close, small bubbles and lifted seams like skin that had been damaged and never healed smoothly. The doors on this side were the same as the others, cheap wood, thin frames, but they seemed more worn, their paint rubbed thinner around the handles, as if people had gripped them too hard. I passed room 24, then 26, and with each number, I felt a tightness in my chest that wasn't quite panic, but wasn't calm either. My hand kept checking the master key ring by feel, as if I needed proof it was still there. Room 28 waited at the end, slightly angled away from the nearest light, so it sat in a dimmer wedge of space. I expected to see the out of order sign taped across it. I expected that bright, cheap paper warning that said, in all caps, "Do not rent." We'd put it there weeks ago and never bothered to remove it because we'd never fixed the room. It should have been the most obvious thing on the door. Our way of declaring, to guests and to ourselves, that this was a closed subject. The sign was gone. For a moment I stood still, and the damp carpet swallowed even that. The door looked bare. Too bare. The number plaque, 28, was slightly crooked, like it had been pried at and not set back straight, and the screw heads looked a shade cleaner than the surrounding metal. My flashlight beam drifted across the handle, and my stomach tightened again, because the handle didn't look like the other handles. It wasn't just shiny from use. It looked wiped, cleaned, as if someone had taken a cloth and rubbed away the dull film that normally sat on Motel metal. The surrounding paint, too, right where fingers would press, looked smoother, like the oil and grit of countless touches had been erased. The copper smell was stronger here. It sat at the back of my throat, making me swallow. I told myself there were explanations. Cleaning staff, maintenance, a bored coworker with a rag, a guest wandering where they shouldn't. My mind kept offering practical stories, stacking them like sandbags against the flood of instinct. But the details weren't cooperating. No one had told me the room had been touched. No one had mentioned removing the sign. And the hallway, now without the vending machine hum, felt like it was holding itself in place. I took one more step toward the door, keys tight in my fist, flashlight beam steady on the handle. I stared at that cleaned metal, at the slight gap where the door met the frame, at the crooked 28, and I listened. The motel made its usual distant noises, pipes, rain, the faintest echo of traffic from the highway. But here, right at the end of hallway B, those sounds seemed far away, pushed through layers. Close up, the air was still enough that I could hear my own pulse, slow and stubborn. Then, from the direction of the vending machines, dark shapes at the end of the corridor, came a single clunk. Not the normal mechanical thunk of a soda dropping. This was slower, heavier, deliberate, like a finger pressing a button and holding it there just long enough to be heard. The clunk came again, softer this time, as if whoever pressed the button had decided not to draw too much attention. I didn't move toward the vending machines. I didn't even look directly at them at first, because I didn't want to reward the sound with my focus. That instinct surprised me, some stubborn refusal to play along. Instead, I kept my eyes on room 28's door and forced myself to catalog what was in front of me, the way you might inspect a scene after a small accident. Details, not feelings. Wood grain, metal, light. Anything that could be named without turning into fear. My flashlight beam slid down the door frame and caught the narrow gap between the door and the jamb. The motel doors never fit perfectly. There's always a little sliver where the building breathes. Through that sliver, I could see the edge of the inside. Darkness, and then something more specific. The deadbolt slide. It was thrown across. Locked from the inside, it took my mind a second to process what my eyes were telling it. Out of order sign removed. Handle wiped. Door locked from inside. That combination didn't belong to any sensible scenario. If maintenance had been in there, the door would be unlocked. If housekeeping had cleaned, they'd have left it open while they worked, or at least they would have mentioned it. If a guest had somehow gotten in, the system would show it, and there would be noise, footsteps, voices, a TV. Even squatters make sound. Silence in a room that supposedly held someone felt like the most impossible part. I stepped closer until my breath warmed the wood. The copper smell was stronger now, and my tongue tasted like pennies. I raised my free hand, knuckles hovering near the door, preparing to knock, because knocking was what you did, the human script you followed to keep things ordinary. Before I could make contact, I paused. My hand froze in midair. From inside the room came a sound so faint I almost missed it. At first, it blended with the rain and distant plumbing, the way you sometimes think you hear a mouse in the walls and then talk yourself out of it. But it repeated, steady, rhythmic. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Not scraping, not clawing, not something frantic. A pen on paper. The sound had the particular softness of writing. Ink dragged over fibers, the tiny stop-start cadence of someone forming letters. It was calm work, patient work, a person doing something normal in a room that wasn't supposed to contain anyone. That calmness made my skin crawl more than any scream could have. I leaned in, ear close to the door without thinking, as if proximity could turn the faint scratch into an explanation. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Each stroke landed with measured certainty, like a metronome. My throat went tight. I forced my voice down into a whisper, not because I was trying to be polite, but because the hallway felt too still for anything louder. "Hello?" I said, low. "Front desk." The words seemed to sink into the damp carpet and not come back. There was no reply. The writing continued, unbroken, as if my voice hadn't reached the other side. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. The sudden buzzing against my thigh jolted me so sharply, my shoulder bumped the door. The vibration was insistent, too alive for the dead hallway. I yanked the phone out, and the screen lit up in my hand. Front desk line 1, the motel's number. Someone was calling the lobby phone from inside the building. Again. For a moment, I considered not answering. The part of me that wanted to survive wanted to keep distance, wanted to retreat to the warm orange lobby and pretend this corridor didn't exist. But the call felt like a hook tugging at my attention, and I hated that it could. I answered with my thumb and held the phone tight to my ear. "Front desk," I whispered. For a second, there was only breathing. Close, slow, the same presence as before, but now it didn't feel like a voice traveling through wires. It felt like something leaning in from the dark space between my ear and my skull. The hallway's silence wrapped around the sound, making it intimate and wrong. "I can't find the right date," the voice whispered. My stomach tightened. I stared at the door. The pen scratching continued on the other side, steady as a heartbeat. "What?" I managed. "The printer keeps changing it," the voice said. "It never prints the same way twice." As the words came through the phone, I became painfully aware of every other sound around me. The rain's muted hiss behind walls, a distant pipe ticking as it cooled, my own breath catching in small, shallow pulls. Even the fluorescent buzz overhead seemed to thin, leaving more room for the whisper to settle. The voice didn't rise or fall in emotion. It spoke like someone describing a minor inconvenience at a late-night gas station. That steadiness made the content worse. If the voice had been frantic, I could have labeled it as a prank, a performance. But calm sounded like truth. "Who is this?" I asked, and the question came out harsher than I intended. "If you're in that room, how are you?" A pause. Not a technical pause, a deliberate one. Then the whisper returned, even closer, as if the phone had stopped being necessary. "I'm in the part that stayed," it said. The words slid under my skin. They weren't poetic. They weren't dramatic. They were wrong in a way that felt specific, like a description of a place, not a metaphor. My eyes drifted back to the gap in the doorframe. The deadbolt was still thrown, locked from inside. "If you're in there," I said, voice tighter now, "open the door." The writing sound stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden it felt like pressure. I realized I'd been using the scratch as proof of something human. Without it, the hallway was just a long, cold throat leading to a door that didn't belong. I held my breath without meaning to. Then, from behind the door, the writing began again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Only now it sounded faster, more purposeful, as if whoever held the pen had leaned harder into the paper. The voice on the phone exhaled, faint and amused. "You can't make it open," it whispered. "You can only make it notice." I swallowed. My fingers tightened around the master keys until the metal edges pressed into my palm. "What do you want?" I asked. The whisper softened. "Room 28, it said again, like a request that had never been answered. Just for one night. I felt the absurd urge to bargain, to treat this like a normal conversation with a difficult guest. But every attempt at normal had been peeled away by details. The wrong receipt date, the monitor reflection, the deadbolt. The whole corridor felt like it was waiting for the next step in a script I didn't know. My gaze flicked once toward the vending machines. Their glass fronts reflected nothing but darkness. The hum that usually filled the end of the hall was still absent, as if the machines had stopped breathing. The copper smell was thick enough now that it coated my tongue. "I'm calling the police," I lied, because the threat felt like the only tool I had left. The whisper didn't react. It only said, almost gently, "They don't come for dates." And then the line went dead. I stared at the phone screen as if it might explain itself. No signal bars, no new call, just my own reflection in the glass, pale and distorted by the hallway light. Behind the door, the pen continued its steady, patient scratching, as if someone had resumed a task after a brief interruption. My heart hammered, not fast, but heavy. The kind of pounding that makes you feel your blood moving. I should have walked away right then. I should have returned to the desk, locked the lobby doors, waited for morning. But the master key ring in my hand had its own gravity, and the part of my mind that needed answers, needed to prove this was still the world I understood, pulled me forward. I took a slow breath, raised the master key, and slid it into the lock of room 28. It went in as if the door had been waiting. The lock turned with a soft, obedient click, the kind that usually means you've done the right thing in the right order. It should have resisted if the deadbolt was thrown. It should have caught if the door was truly locked from inside. Instead, the mechanism gave way too easily, like it had only been pretending to be secure. I pushed, expecting at least the weight of a stuck frame, the drag of swollen wood, the stubbornness of an old building. The door swung inward without complaint. Cold air spilled out. Not the stale, room temperature air of an unused space, but a clean, biting cold that hit my face and throat like opening a refrigerator. It carried that copper smell in a concentrated wave, and underneath it, something else. Old fabric, damp drywall, and a faint chemical sweetness, like film or tape that's been stored too long. My eyes watered instantly. I stood in the doorway for half a second, letting the chill roll over me, my flashlight beam hovering at the threshold as if it didn't want to cross. Inside, the room was dim, not dark, just dim in a way that made the corners look heavier. The only steady light came from the bathroom, a small night light glowing through a half-open door, pale and round and strangely soft, like a moon trapped in a closet. It didn't brighten the room so much as it made the darkness more visible, outlining the edges of furniture and casting a faint sheen across the carpet. I stepped in. The carpet under my shoes felt different immediately. Not wet, but used, like it had been breathed on, warmed and cooled, over and over. The fibers pressed up slightly against my soles, then released with a slow reluctance, as if they remembered weight. The copper smell intensified the moment the door clicked behind me, sealing me into it. And for an irrational second, I tasted pennies so strongly I thought I might have bitten my tongue. My flashlight swept across the bed first. The covers were pulled tight in crisp hospital corners, the way housekeeping does when they want a room to look untouched. But the fabric looked older than it should have, more faded, more matte, like it had been washed through 100 years of motel cycles. The headboard was the same shape as the others, but the wood had a different varnish, darker and less glossy. On the wall above it, a framed print hung slightly crooked, a landscape that looked like it belonged in an office from a decade I couldn't name. Then my light moved to the dresser. My breath caught. On top of the dresser sat a television that didn't belong in any room we currently rented. Not a flat screen. Not even one of the old chunky CRTs we'd had when I first started. This was an older model with built-in buttons that looked worn smooth, like too many fingers had pressed them in a hurry. Beneath it, tucked neatly into the space where we normally kept brochures and the remote, was a VCR. A real one, black plastic, its slot slightly open like a mouth waiting to be fed. We didn't have VCRs. We hadn't had VCRs in years. Not at this motel. Not anywhere I'd worked. The sight of it was so out of place that my mind reached for the wrong file, like when you try to open a familiar app and your finger hits a different icon. For a moment, I felt a stupid, disorienting nostalgia, like I'd stepped into a childhood memory, until the cold air reminded me this wasn't nostalgia, it was intrusion. On the nightstand beside the bed was a beige telephone with a coiled cord, the kind that sits in an office and survives for decades because nobody can be bothered to replace it. Our rooms had cordless phones. I'd checked them myself during room inspections. This corded phone looked older, the plastic slightly yellowed, the buttons shiny from use. I blinked hard, as if that might rearrange the room back into the version I understood. It didn't. My flashlight beam dropped to the floor, and that was when I saw the papers. Receipts, scattered across the carpet, like someone had dropped a handful and watched them flutter down. Some were crumpled, some lay flat, edges curled. Some were stacked in small, careful piles, as if they'd been sorted and then disturbed. The thermal paper caught the flashlight's glare and shone back at me, bright and accusing. I crouched, my knees stiff with cold, and picked up the nearest one with 2 fingers, as if touching it too firmly might smear the ink. Room, 28 rate, $59.99. Guest, Elias Morrow. Date, November 3, 2004. I flipped it over. Blank. I picked up another. Same room, same rate, same name, different date. November 3, 2005. Another. November 3, 2011. Another. November 3, 2020. The dates jumped across years like stones across a dark river, but the name stayed constant, printed in the same sharp font, always centered in the same place, always declaring, with bureaucratic certainty, that Elias Morrow belonged to room 28. My fingers began to tremble, and the thermal paper fluttered softly in my grip, making a dry whispering sound that felt too loud in the cold room. I set the receipts down and stood. The air seemed thicker now, as if the room didn't like being observed. The copper smell pressed at the back of my throat. My flashlight beam swept over the walls, and the wallpaper pattern looked subtly wrong. Still floral, still motel ugly, but the colors were different. The print slightly faded, like it had been chosen in another era. The curtains, too, looked older, heavier fabric than what we use now. Even the lamp on the desk had a different shape, its base more squared, its shade less clean. Everything in the room carried a quiet suggestion of then instead of now. From the bathroom doorway, the nightlight continued to glow, steady and patient. It made the tiles beyond it look pale, almost luminous, like a space that wasn't fully part of the room. I took a step toward it, more drawn than decided. The cold bit at my cheeks. The carpet breathed under my foot again, that same soft resistance, like a sigh. As I moved, the silence shifted. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling. Then I realized the sound wasn't coming from the hallway anymore. It was inside the room, closer, more intimate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The steady rhythm of a pen moving over paper. But now it wasn't behind the door. It was inside the wall. The sound seemed to travel from the area behind the headboard, muted by drywall and insulation, like someone was writing in the space between this room and the next. The strokes were calm, consistent, not frantic, not interrupted. Whoever was writing didn't seem worried about being heard. It sounded like a person keeping notes, like someone logging what happened. I stood frozen, with my flashlight beam fixed on the headboard, as if I could burn through the wall with light. My pulse thudded in my ears. The air felt colder with each second, and the copper smell grew sharper, almost electrical. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I leaned forward, ear tilting toward the wall, and the sound became clearer. I could even hear tiny pauses, the brief lift of pen from paper, the slight change in pressure as if letters were being crossed or underlined. In that moment, the idea that this was a simple, out-of-order room, mildew and plumbing and maintenance delays, collapsed completely. Out of order suggested something broken within the same rules as everything else. This felt like a room operating by a different set of rules, a room that had its own time, its own inventory, its own records stacked across years like those receipts on the floor. The writing continued, steady and deliberate, as if the room itself was taking notes on my presence. And standing there in fridge-cold air, surrounded by relics that didn't belong to the present, staring at a scattered paper trail that shouldn't exist, I understood the twist before my mind had words for it. Room 28 wasn't just closed. It wasn't just avoided. It was misfiled in reality, out of time, and something inside it was actively documenting, printing, and preserving whatever stepped too close. For a long moment, I didn't move. I stood in the doorway's cold spill, with my flashlight held in a stiff grip, listening to that steady scratch from inside the wall and trying to decide whether I was more afraid of staying or leaving. The room felt like it was waiting for a response, like a clerk behind a counter who won't speak until you say the right first word. I forced myself to breathe slowly through my nose, counting the inhales the way you do when you're trying not to let adrenaline take the wheel. In, out. The copper smell clung to the back of my throat. The bathroom nightlight kept glowing through the half-open door, soft and round, making everything outside its reach look heavier. When the mind can't make sense of a thing, it tries to organize it into a story it already understands. That was what I did. I told myself the VCR was a leftover unit that had somehow never been removed. I told myself someone had staged the room. Maintenance playing a joke, some weird guest sneaking in and trying to mess with the night auditor. I even told myself that the scattered receipts were just paper, that dates across years could be explained by a printer reusing an old template. The lies sounded thin in the cold air, but they were still something to hold on to. I took a cautious step farther in, and the carpet gave that strange, soft resistance again, like it was exhaling under my weight. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Continued behind the headboard, steady, deliberate, not reacting to my movement. Whoever was writing didn't sound surprised I was here. That calmness made my skin prickle. My flashlight beam drifted back to the dresser, almost against my will. The TV and VCR sat there like a staged exhibit, an older era preserved in plastic, on the shelf beneath them, where a remote would normally be. Something dark and rectangular lay half-tucked behind the VCR, as if someone had tried to hide it without trying very hard. I moved closer and saw it was a cassette tape, the kind I hadn't held in years. The plastic case was slightly scuffed, and a strip of masking tape had been stuck across the front as a label. Someone had written on it in block letters with a thick marker, "Lobby, night." I stared at those words longer than I should have. In any other context, they would have been nothing. A boring label on an old tape. In this room, with that pen scratching inside the wall and the receipts scattered like shedskin, the label felt like a message. Not addressed to me exactly, but placed where I would inevitably find it if I kept looking for answers. My first instinct was to leave it alone. My second instinct was to rationalize again. Maybe this was evidence. Maybe this was the prank's punchline. Maybe the motel had old surveillance recordings on tape before we switched to digital, and someone had stored them here. The problem with that explanation was simple. I'd never seen tapes in the office, never seen a VCR in storage, never once heard my manager mention analog recordings. This motel did not keep anything that carefully. We barely kept fresh coffee. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Continued, and the sound tightened something in my chest. The writing felt like pressure now, like a presence doing work behind the drywall. I held the cassette in my hand and realized it was cold. Cold in a way that matched the room, not in a way that matched something left in a drawer. The plastic felt as if it had been kept in this temperature for a long time. I turned it over. No other labels, no date, no initials. Just lobby, night in heavy marker. Okay, I whispered, mostly to myself, because speaking in that room felt like it mattered. My voice sounded dull, absorbed by carpet and cold air. I slid the tape from its case. The film inside looked intact, the reels full. I glanced once toward the headboard. The scratching never paused. It kept going, steady and unbothered, as if it had been happening long before I arrived and would continue long after I left. That made my decision for me in a way I didn't like to admit. If the room was going to log me, I wanted something that logged it back. I crouched by the dresser and pressed the eject button on the VCR. The machine responded with a soft mechanical click, and the slot opened wider, like a mouth. Even that small sound felt too loud in the cold quiet. I hesitated with the tape poised in my fingers, expecting, irrationally, that something would surge from the machine, or that the room would react, that the scratching would stop, that the nightlight would flicker. Nothing changed. Only the steady scratch behind the wall continued, patient as a clerk stamping paperwork. I slid the cassette in. The VCR swallowed it with a slow, deliberate pull. For a second, there was silence. Then the machine came to life with a low whir that sounded like something clearing its throat. The TV clicked on by itself with a soft pop, and the screen filled with static. Gray snow, hissing gently through the speaker. The sound wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make my shoulders tense. It reminded me of late nights as a kid, waking up to a television left on. The static making the room feel inhabited by something that wasn't human. I stood and took a half step back, flashlight beam wavering, my pulse thudding slow and heavy. The static flickered. A horizontal line rolled down the screen. The image stabilized into black and white footage. It was the lobby. My lobby, unmistakable in shape. The same front desk counter, the same glass doors, the same brochure rack near the orange lamp. But it was wrong in small ways that made my skin tighten. The angle was too low and slightly off-center, as if the camera had been placed on a chair instead of mounted near the ceiling. The decor looked older. The brochure rack held different pamphlets. The lamp had a different shade, and the computer terminal behind the desk was bulky and beige, the kind you'd see in an office 20 years ago. Even the carpet pattern looked newer on the tape than it did now, like this recording belonged to a time before the hallway stains set in. The lobby on screen was quiet. No people, no movement. But I could hear sound through the TV speaker, a faint HVAC hum, the distant grind of the ice machine, a thin fluorescent buzz. The audio was not clean. It carried a low tape hiss underneath everything, like the lobby itself was being recorded through a layer of dust. Still, the sounds were so familiar that for a second my brain tried to treat the footage like a live feed. I caught myself leaning forward, as if I could step into it and stand behind that counter where things still looked simpler. On the recording, the wall clock above the brochure rack ticked steadily. The numbers were too small for me to read from where I stood, but I could see the second hand move, jerky and mechanical. The glass doors reflected the parking lot's faint lights, and the rain outside was visible as pale streaks on the black pavement. Everything about it felt real enough to be comforting, until a figure entered the frame from the left. A man walked behind the front desk and sat down in the chair. He moved slowly, like someone who had been awake too long, shoulders slightly rounded with fatigue. He looked older than me, heavier in the face, with that drained expression night work carves into people. The motel uniform he wore wasn't ours. Similar, but the logo patch on the chest looked different. Simpler. He rubbed his hands together as if he was cold, then reached toward the keyboard and paused, listening. From the TV speaker came a faint sound that made my stomach drop. A receipt printer beep. The same clean, confident beep I'd heard in the lobby less than an hour ago. The man on the tape flinched. He turned his head toward the printer off screen, just out of the camera's view. He stared for a long moment, as if deciding whether to touch the paper. Then slowly, he leaned forward toward the camera, eyes narrowing as though he could sense something on the other side of the lens. And then he looked straight into it, straight into me, as if he could see where I was standing in room 28, watching. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. The man on the screen didn't just glance in the camera's direction. He fixed his eyes on it with the tired focus of someone who'd been waiting for an answer. The footage wavered slightly, the image carrying that soft VHS shimmer at the edges, and a thin tape, hiss-threaded under the lobby, sounds like dust in sunlight. I could hear the faint buzz of fluorescent lights through the TV speaker, the distant grind of the ice machine, and beneath everything, a low, persistent crackle, like the tape itself was struggling to hold the moment in place. My flashlight beam slipped down toward the carpet without me noticing, as if my hand had decided the room didn't need more light, only less attention. On the screen, the man leaned closer to the camera until his face filled more of the frame. His eyes were bloodshot, not in a dramatic way, but in the practical way of someone who'd lost sleep in small, regular pieces. He swallowed, ran his palm down his cheek, and spoke in a voice so low it felt like it belonged to the building rather than to him. "If you're watching this," he said, then it printed again. He paused, as if listening for the same beep I'd heard. The tape audio crackled, and the static pulsed once, faintly, like a heartbeat under the hiss. "And it found you," he added, softer, as though the idea itself hurt. I stood there in room 28 with my shoulders tense, feeling the cold air tighten around my ribs. A part of me wanted to shut the TV off, eject the tape, back out into the hallway, and pretend I'd never seen any of it. But the man's face held me in place. His exhaustion didn't look staged. It looked lived in. The way real fear settles into a person after the adrenaline burns out and leaves only dread and routine. He rubbed his hands together like he couldn't get warm. Even though in the footage, the lobby looked the same temperature it always did. Sterile heat. Motel heat. The kind that never reaches your bones. "I tried ignoring it," he said. "That was the first mistake. You think if you don't look at it, it can't be real." His mouth twitched with something that wasn't quite a smile. "But it's a printer. It wants to be read." The word printer made my stomach tighten. I felt the folded receipt in my pocket again like a bruise. On the tape, the man glanced off screen toward the front desk printer as if it were a living thing. "It prints the room," he continued. "It prints the name. It prints the date. And if you touch it, if you accept it..." He stopped, breathed out through his nose, and the audio caught a little, a brief tape warble that made his voice dip in pitch. "It starts treating you like inventory." The fluorescent buzz through the TV speaker grew louder for a second and then softened again, like the building in the recording was shifting in and out of attention. The man reached toward the phone on the desk and didn't pick it up, just rested his fingers on it like it was a talisman. "I called for help," he said. "The first night it happened, I called my manager. I called the sheriff. I called anyone whose number I could remember." He looked straight into the camera again, eyes wet in a way that made my throat tighten. "But the calls don't go out the way you think they do. Sometimes the line is dead. Sometimes it rings and rings and nobody answers. Sometimes..." He hesitated, and the tape crackled in the pause. "Sometimes it calls you back." A sound rose in the recording, faint at first, then unmistakable. The lobby phone ringing. It was the same ring I'd heard tonight, sharp and too clean for the quiet. The man's shoulders lifted, as if he'd been shocked by electricity. He didn't answer it. He just watched the phone like he was watching a snake decide whether to strike. The ring stopped. The silence that followed on the tape was thick, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing forward, and the static hiss underneath it seemed to brighten, as if the tape itself was nervous. "I tried leaving," the man said, voice thinner now. "That's what you'll try. You'll tell yourself you're not trapped because you can walk out the door." His eyes flicked toward the glass entrance behind him. In the footage, rain streaked down the doors, and the parking lot reflected neon the same way it did tonight. "I went out the front," he whispered, "and I came back in through the front. I went out the back, and I came back through the back. I even drove." He swallowed hard, and the tape gave a low, strained flutter. "I drove until the highway signs looked wrong, until the exits repeated like a stuck record, until the same gas station lights came up again, like I'd never moved. It loops." He leaned in closer, voice barely above breath. "It doesn't lock the doors. It locks the night." My hands had started to shake. Not violently, not enough to drop anything, but enough that the flashlight beam trembled over the carpet. The cold in room 28 felt sharper now, almost punitive, as if it didn't like me hearing these things. The pen scratch inside the wall had quieted, or maybe I just couldn't hear it over my pulse. On screen, the man pressed his palm to his chest as if he could slow his heart by force. "The room isn't a room," he said. "That's the part nobody believes. You think it's mildew, plumbing, a weird smell, a bad patch of carpet, but it's not." He stared into the camera, and his voice gained a brittle urgency. "It's a date the building decided to keep." The static pulsed again, brighter this time, and for a second the image wobbled as if the tape didn't like that sentence. The man blinked through it and continued anyway, stubborn. "It keeps printing until it lands on the right day," he whispered. "Or until it lands on you." He took a shaky breath. "Listen to me. Do not let it print your name." The words came out like a plea he'd practiced. "If you see your name on that paper, don't read it out loud. Don't sign anything. Don't make it official." His mouth tightened, and he looked briefly like someone about to cry. Not in fear, but in exhaustion. The deep, drained sorrow of a person who's been warning the dark and getting no answer. Behind him, in the reflection of the glass doors, something tall stood in the lobby's mirrored surface. At first, it was just a darker patch of shadow against shadow. Then the tape's contrast shifted slightly, and I could make out the shape. Upright, close, too close to the man's back, as if it had been standing there the entire time. It didn't move the way a person shifts weight. It simply existed, a vertical presence that made the lobby around it look thinner. The man didn't turn. He kept his eyes locked on the camera, as if turning would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would be the same as signing a receipt. The phone rang again on the tape. One sharp ring that made me flinch in the real room. The man's face tightened. He whispered, almost inaudible, "Don't," and then the footage buckled. The screen tore with a diagonal ripple, the audio spiking into a harsh burst of static. The image jumped, snapped back, then split again, as if something had yanked the tape forward too fast. For half a second, the lobby on screen blurred into a smear of light and shadow, and the tall reflection stretched unnaturally, longer than the doors could contain. Then the VCR made a hard, mechanical clack. The cassette ejected on its own, sliding out with abrupt force like the machine was spitting it away. The TV screen collapsed into snow, the static hissing louder for a moment before settling into a dull roar. I stood in the cold with the tape half out of the slot, my hands trembling, and the sense of being watched tightened around me. Not from the hallway, not from the lobby, but from the room itself, as if it had heard the warning and didn't like me receiving it. The tape sat halfway ejected from the VCR, like a tongue refusing to swallow its own words. Static hissed from the TV speaker, filling the cold room with that restless sandpaper sound. For a moment, I couldn't move, not because I was paralyzed with terror in some dramatic way, but because my brain had gone oddly quiet, as if it were waiting for the next instruction. The man's warning looped in my head with the stubborn clarity of something you can't unhear. Don't let it print your name. The tall reflection behind him on the glass doors felt like it had stepped out of the tape and into the air around me. My fingers were still shaking, the flashlight beam jittering across the carpet and receipts like a nervous pulse. Then the writing started again. Scratch. 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 It wasn't faint anymore. It came from behind the headboard wall with renewed purpose, faster, heavier, as if whoever held the pen had pressed down harder after the tape ended. The sound crawled up my spine. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a response, like the room had heard the warning and was recording my reaction to it in real time. That was the last push I needed. I grabbed the cassette case from the dresser with one hand, the master key ring still clenched in the other, and backed toward the door. The cold air seemed to cling to me as I moved, as if it didn't want to let my skin warm up again. The bathroom nightlight glowed steadily behind me, pale and indifferent. Scratch, 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 continued, and as I reached for the doorknob, I had the strange, vivid sense that if I stayed one more minute, the room would start writing my name. The handle turned under my palm. The metal felt too clean, too slick. I pulled the door open and stepped into the hallway, like someone surfacing from deep water. Hallway B was darker than I remembered, even though the overhead lights were on. The air out here felt warmer compared to the fridge cold room, but only by contrast. The copper smell followed me like a thin film on my tongue. The vending machines at the end of the corridor were still silent, their hum absent, their glass fronts reflecting only dim hallway light and the vague shape of the door I'd just left. I shut the door behind me without locking it. The click sounded too loud. I didn't walk back to the lobby. I moved faster than that, the kind of quick, controlled pace that tries not to become a run, because running feels like admitting you're hunted. My keys clinked against each other with each step. The flashlight beam swung low, skimming carpet and baseboards. The exit sign at the junction glowed brighter as I approached, its red letters buzzing faintly. And when I stepped beneath it, the light made the hallway's peeling wallpaper look raw, like exposed skin. The lobby's warmer light was a relief when I reached it, but it didn't settle me. It felt staged now, like a set built to resemble safety. The orange lamp still glowed. The brochure rack still leaned patiently in its corner. The coffee pot still sat on the warmer, sour, and forgotten. The receipt printer was quiet, which should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like the pause you get before another beep. I went straight behind the counter and grabbed the desk phone. My hand shook so badly, I hit the wrong button first, then corrected. I called my manager. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then voicemail. I hung up before the beep. Tried again. Voicemail. I tried the maintenance number taped under the counter. No answer. I tried the non-emergency number for the local police department, the one we called when guests refused to leave. The call didn't even ring. It just dropped into that dead, empty tone that said the line wasn't going anywhere. A sick thought slid into place. The calls don't go out the way you think they do. I stared at the phone in my hand as if it might change its mind. My reflection stared back at me from the glass doors. Pale, tense, too awake. For a moment, I considered locking the front doors and staying behind the desk until morning. But the idea of sitting in that lobby, waiting, felt worse than moving. Waiting is what you do when you trust time. I wasn't sure time was behaving anymore. I decided to leave. Not just the lobby, the motel, the entire building. I told myself that if I could get into my car and drive far enough, the night would become normal again by force. My hands moved on their own. I grabbed my jacket from the hook, snatched my car keys from the little ceramic dish by the register, and walked toward the employee door behind the desk, the back exit that opened to the staff parking area. The handle was cold under my palm. I pushed the door open and stepped out. Rain hit my face immediately, cold and sharp, and for a second the sensation anchored me. Wet air. Real weather. The smell of asphalt and damp leaves. The sound of rain falling without insulation. I inhaled hard, greedy for the outside world, and started down the short walkway toward the lot. I took 3 steps. On the 3rd step, something strange happened to my vision. It wasn't a blackout. It was more like the world softened at the edges, like a camera lens fogging from breath. The parking lot lights smeared slightly. The rain streaks blurred into white lines. I blinked, hard, and the blur didn't clear right away. My stomach dropped, and my body tensed as if it recognized a trap before my mind could name it. I blinked again, and suddenly I was stepping through the front doors of the lobby. Rain on my cheeks, jacket damp at the shoulders, cold air still in my lungs. The bell above the entrance didn't ring, but the doors swung shut behind me with the same soft, polite thud they always made. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, staring straight ahead, as if the lobby itself might apologize and reset. The orange lamp glowed. The brochures waited. The heater hummed faintly under the counter. Outside the glass, the parking lot was the same empty black glass under sodium lights. My heart hammered once, hard enough to make my vision pulse. I turned slowly, like quick movement might rip whatever thin fabric was holding this together, and looked at the wall clock above the brochure rack. The hands were perfectly still for a fraction of a second. Then the second hand ticked. The time read 1:12 a.m. The exact time the man on the tape had been sitting behind the desk, eyes red and pleading into the camera. A coldness moved through my chest that had nothing to do with weather. I backed toward the counter, drawn to the monitors like they were the only thing that had ever told the truth in this building. My fingers hovered over the screen controls. Then I forced myself to look up at the live feeds. Lobby entrance. Empty, except for my own damp reflection. Parking lot. Empty. Rain shimmering. Hallway A. Still. Hallway B. Hallway B wasn't a hallway. For one blink of time, the feed showed a corridor that seemed to stretch too far, repeating doors like a mirror trick. Door after door, identical wood, identical crooked number plaque, and every plaque read the same. 28, 28, 28, 28. The corridor went on until the image dissolved into darkness, as if the camera couldn't render any more of it. I blinked, and the feed snapped back to normal hallway B, the usual dim stretch, the vending machines at the far end, nothing moving. But my stomach didn't unclench, because I had seen it. And because it had looked less like a glitch, and more like the building showing me what it really contained when it stopped pretending. I turned my head toward the glass doors again, and the rain outside seemed louder now, as if the storm had leaned closer. My palms were damp against the counter edge. The folded receipt in my pocket felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. The warning from the tape echoed in my skull. But the deeper realization was worse. I hadn't just watched a recording of someone else's night. I had landed inside it. Time had snapped to the tape's moment, and whatever rules governed that moment had quietly rewritten my role. I wasn't an observer anymore, standing at a safe distance with my hands on a remote control. I was behind the counter, inside the loop, with the clock set to 1:12, and a room at the end of hallway B, waiting to print the next line of the ledger. The lobby should have felt like a refuge after hallway B, but at 1:12 a.m., it felt more like the center of a diagram. Quiet, carefully arranged, waiting for the next input. I stayed behind the counter because it was the only boundary I trusted, my hands resting on the laminate edge where my thumb had worn its familiar groove earlier. The rain outside pressed itself against the glass doors in soft sheets, the neon vacancy sign buzzing and blinking red across the wet lot like a pulse. The heater hummed low beneath the counter, then settled into a thin, steady warmth that never quite reached my bones. I kept my eyes moving. Clock, doors, monitors, printer. Like if I watched enough angles, at once I could catch whatever rule was about to shift. The folded receipt in my pocket felt heavier now, not because paper gains weight, but because my body had started treating it like a threat. I was staring at the lobby entrance feed when the image on the screen changed in a way that didn't look like motion detection or compression noise. A figure appeared in the camera view without the normal approach. No headlights sweeping the lot. No silhouette crossing the glass. No door movement. One moment, the space outside the doors was empty. The next, a man stood just inside the lobby, a few steps in from the entrance, as if he'd been there the whole time and I'd simply failed to see him. He looked ordinary in the most unsettling way. Early 40s, average build, pale from the cold, rain beaded on the shoulders of his jacket. His hair lay damp and flattened at the forehead, and his hands hung loosely at his sides like he was waiting politely to be acknowledged. There was nothing theatrical about him. No ragged breathing, no strange posture, no obvious ghost story cues. That normalness set my nerves on edge more than any overt menace could have, because it suggested he was playing by rules I didn't know. He took a small step closer to the desk, stopping at a distance that would have been polite in any normal interaction. The lobby light caught his name tag, and my stomach tightened. It wasn't one of ours. It was an older style, thicker plastic, slightly yellowed at the edges, the kind you'd see in a motel photo from the early 2000s. The lettering was simple, blocky, and it read, Elias. No last name, just the first, as if the building had shortened him down to the minimum required field. He looked at me steadily, not aggressively, with the patient expression of someone who'd already decided the outcome of this conversation. Then, in that same calm voice I'd heard through the phone, he said, "I have a reservation." The phrase landed with a gentle certainty, like a line he'd rehearsed until it no longer carried emotion. I swallowed and forced my own voice to stay level. "What name is it under?" I asked, even though my throat felt tight. and my palms were damp. His gaze didn't change. "Elias Morrow," he said. Then, as if the exchange hadn't satisfied him, he repeated, "I have a reservation." The repetition didn't sound confused. It sounded procedural, like he was trying to trigger the correct response in the system. Something in my chest urged me to look away from him, toward the glass doors, toward the reflection, because I remembered the monitor stutter, the tall shape behind me, the way reality seemed to choose reflections as its loophole. I glanced at the doors without moving my head too much and saw my own pale face reflected back at me in the dark glass, along with the lobby behind me. Elias's reflection stood there too, just behind my shoulder line, but it didn't behave properly. When he shifted his weight, barely, a subtle movement of a tired man standing too long, his reflection lagged by the smallest fraction of a second, like a video out of sync with its audio. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was the kind of wrongness you could almost miss, and once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. I forced my eyes back to his real face, feeling my heartbeat thud slow and heavy. "The system says room 28 is out of service," I said, because practical sentences were all I had left. "I can put you in another." Elias's expression remained politely blank. "You already printed it," he said softly, and his eyes flicked, not to the computer, not to the key rack, but to the receipt printer beside my keyboard, as if it were the true point of contact. "I heard the beep," he added, almost conversationally. "That means you recognized me." The words made my stomach drop, because they framed the printer sound as something like consent, like a door I'd opened without realizing. As if responding to that thought, the heater under the counter clicked off mid-hum. The sudden absence of warmth made the air feel thinner. The fluorescent buzz overhead rose in my awareness, sharper now, like the lights had been turned up without changing brightness. Outside, the rain seemed to hush, not stop, but soften into a listening presence, the way a crowd quiets when someone steps to a microphone. Elias took another small step, still polite, still measured, stopping at the invisible boundary of the desk. "Room 28, he said, and the courtesy in his tone made it worse, like he was ordering tea, not asking for the one room that sat misfiled in time. "Please." He kept his hands visible, palms relaxed, posture respectful, the kind of body language that would normally lower your guard. But my guard didn't lower. The longer he stood there, the more I felt the lobby itself leaning toward him, as if he belonged to it more than I did. I could smell the rain on his jacket, cold and metallic, and beneath it, that faint copper note I'd tasted in hallway B, pennies in the back of the throat. I opened my mouth to refuse, to say anything that might keep this from becoming official, but Elias's gaze held mine in a way that felt less like intimidation and more like waiting, patient, inevitable, almost sad. "You don't have to be afraid," he said quietly, and for the first time, his voice carried something close to human fatigue. "It's only a checkout." The word struck oddly, wrong in this context, like he'd skipped ahead in the process. I didn't answer fast enough, and in that small pause, the lobby grew even stiller, as if it were giving him room to finish the sentence he'd been trying to complete for years. Then the receipt printer behind the counter gave a soft, confident beep, clean and certain, like it had just recognized someone standing in front of the desk. The beep seemed to thicken the air. A thin strip of thermal paper began to feed from the printer slot in a slow curl, bright white against the lobby's dimness, and my eyes snapped to it before I could stop them. Elias didn't reach for the paper. He didn't need to. He simply watched it emerge with the calm of someone who'd seen this exact motion more times than he could count. The paper made that faint, dry whispering sound as it curled, like something breathing through teeth. My throat tightened. I remembered the warning from the tape with sudden, painful clarity. Don't let it print your name. And I forced myself not to read whatever had just appeared. Elias's gaze lifted from the printer to me. Up close, he looked more tired than threatening. There were faint shadows under his eyes, and his skin had that pale, drained quality of someone who hadn't seen real daylight in a long time. Rain beaded on his jacket in small, shining dots, but they didn't drip the way they should. They clung there, suspended, as if the moisture couldn't quite decide whether it belonged to fabric or air. I swallowed and kept my hands on the counter where he could see them, as if visible hands could keep the situation in the world of people. "What do you want?" I asked. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Elias didn't smile. If anything, his mouth tightened with something like restraint, as if he'd learned that displaying emotion only invited the wrong kind of attention. "You help me check out," he said. The words were simple, almost bureaucratic. He nodded slightly toward the printer, toward the curling strip of paper. "That's all." "That's not all," I replied, and I hated the way my voice wavered at the edges. "You can't. There's no reservation. There's no record. Room 28 is..." I stopped myself before I said wrong, because saying it out loud felt like giving it shape. "Room 28 isn't available. It's always available," Elias said. And this time the phrase carried a different weight, less like a threat, more like a tired truth. "It's the only thing that stays consistent." His eyes flicked toward the wall clock, then back to me. "Everything else moves. The night moves. The dates move. People move." His voice lowered. I didn't. I took a slow breath. "What are you?" I asked, though the question felt childish the moment it left my mouth. Elias's shoulders rose and fell in a small sigh. He looked past me for a second, toward the shadowed corner by the brochure rack, as if he didn't trust the lobby to hear his words without twisting them. "I was supposed to leave years ago," he said. "I was supposed to get in my car and drive home like any other night." He paused, then added almost clinically, "There was an accident." He didn't embellish it. He didn't offer the dramatic details people usually cling to when they talk about death. It sounded like a fact he'd repeated until it lost its sharp edges. "The town forgot," he continued. "It had to. Towns always forget what they can't fix." The fluorescent buzz overhead sharpened again, and I had the sudden sensation that the ceiling was closer than it should be. A faint creak came from somewhere above the lobby, slow wood shifting, or a pipe expanding, except it didn't sound like the building settling. It sounded like something adjusting its weight, like a presence repositioning itself in the space between ceiling tiles and roof. My stomach tightened. Elias didn't look up. He didn't need to. He spoke on, calm but careful. "The motel didn't forget," he said. "It remembered me the way it remembers transactions. A name, a room, a date." His eyes went distant for a moment, unfocused, as if he was looking through layers of night stacked on each other. It kept the moment I didn't leave. It kept the paperwork. It kept the beep. His gaze returned to the printer. The paper continued to curl out, inch by inch, patient as a clock. I became the part that stayed, Elias said quietly. Not all of me, just enough. I felt cold spread through my chest. So you're trapped, I said. And it wasn't sympathy, not yet. It was logic trying to build a frame. Elias nodded once. Trapped in a checkout that never finishes. He shifted his hand slightly, and again I saw that tiny delay in his reflection on the glass doors, like time didn't travel through him at the same speed. It keeps trying to complete the process, he said. It prints, it calls, it loops the exits. It waits for someone on your side of the counter to do what the system requires. He leaned forward just enough that his voice lowered, intimate and steady. A signature, a confirmation, something living to make it official. My mouth went dry. I glanced at the curling receipt and forced my eyes away before they could focus on the printed line. No, I said. I'm not signing anything. I stopped, because words like agree and accept felt dangerous here. I'm calling the police. Elias's expression didn't change. They don't come, he said, and there was no smugness in it, only resignation. Not for this, not for dates. He gestured subtly toward my phone on the counter, where the screen still showed no service. You can press buttons, he said. The building will let you feel like you're doing something, but it decides what leaves. I reached for the phone anyway, because defiance is sometimes the only way to keep your spine from dissolving. I tried the emergency number this time, fingers clumsy. The call failed immediately, dropping into silence without even a ring. I tried again. Nothing. My skin prickled, and I felt stupidly exposed, like a child demonstrating a magic trick that wouldn't work in front of an adult. I set the phone down hard enough that it thudded against the counter. There are cameras, I snapped, gesturing toward the monitor bank. Everything's recorded. If you're in my lobby. Elias followed my gesture with his eyes, and for a second, something like pity softened his face. The cameras see what it allows, he said. Sometimes they show you the truth, just enough to keep you moving. Sometimes they show you nothing, to keep you alone. He swallowed, and his voice dipped. It wants you isolated. It wants you tired. It wants you to do the easy thing. He nodded again toward the receipt printer. Sign. Confirm. Finish. I tried another angle, because my mind couldn't tolerate helplessness. Why me? I demanded. Why now? My voice cracked on the second question. Elias's eyes flicked to the wall clock again, then to the glass doors, where rain ran down in silver threads. Because you heard the beep, he said. Because you looked. He hesitated, and in that small pause I heard another faint creak above us, as if something in the ceiling space had leaned closer to listen. Elias's voice softened. It finds night people, he said. People who work when the world sleeps. People who don't have witnesses. My pulse thudded slow and heavy. I looked at Elias's face, at the quiet exhaustion, the careful politeness, and I realized the worst part. He didn't feel like the predator. He felt like the messenger, or the bait, or the person caught in the same machinery who'd learned how to speak its language. That didn't make him safe. It made him complicated. It made the choice in front of me feel like a moral trap instead of a simple escape. Elias leaned in just a fraction, and his voice dropped to a near whisper. If you don't help me check out, he said, you'll do this again. He nodded toward the wall clock. It will be 1:12, then 1:12 again, then 1:12 again. His eyes held mine, and each time it repeats, you'll become a little more like me. He lifted his hand slightly, palm up, as if offering something. A little more stayed. My stomach turned. I imagined my name printed on those receipts. Imagined the motel filing me into its ledger the way it had filed Elias. I imagined hearing the printer beep for me, night after night, until my reflection lagged too, until the building recognized me as inventory. Behind me, the monitors flickered. Not a full glitch, just a brief shimmer across the screens, like a ripple passing through water. And on the hallway B feed, for one breath of time, the corridor stretched longer than the building could contain. Door after door repeated into darkness, each one marked with the same crooked plaque. 28, 28, 28, 28. A hallway of identical doors multiplying like a thought you can't stop thinking. Then the image snapped back to normal. Elias watched my face and said softly, "You see?" The hallway feed snapping back to normal didn't undo what I'd seen. It only made it worse, the way a smile from someone lying doesn't erase the lie. My eyes stayed on the monitors for a beat too long, trying to decide whether the corridor of repeating doors had been a glitch or a warning. In the corner of my vision, Elias stood patiently at the counter, rain-beaded jacket, old name tag, hands relaxed like a man checking into a motel after a long drive. He looked so ordinary that my mind kept trying to assign him a normal motive. But the lobby itself felt tuned to him now, as if his presence adjusted the building's volume settings. The fluorescent buzz overhead sharpened again. The heater under the counter clicked and went silent mid-hum. Even the rain outside seemed to soften, not stopping, just hush-hush, like it was listening. The receipt printer's paper continued to curl out in slow, white increments, the thermal chatter quiet but persistent, and I forced myself not to read it. My chest felt tight, not from panic, but from the weight of the choice pressing down. Sign, confirm, complete, become part of the ledger, or refuse and risk being ground down by repetition until I was the one standing politely at the desk, saying the same sentence forever. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice practical, anchored. "If this is real, if you're real, then tell me how to stop it without doing what it wants." I didn't say sign, didn't say check out, because those words felt like they had hooks on them. Elias's expression flickered, and for the first time, his calm looked strained. His eyes shifted toward the glass doors behind me, not as if checking the parking lot, but as if checking the reflection. I followed his glance without fully meaning to, turning my head just enough to see the lobby's mirror image in the dark panes. My own reflection hovered there, pale and tense behind the desk. Elias's reflection stood a few feet in front of mine, slightly dimmer, edges faintly delayed like before. Then I saw what he'd been looking at. Something tall stood directly behind Elias's reflection, so close it was inside his outline, closer than human space allows. It wasn't a clear figure, not a person with features, but a vertical density of darkness that made the lobby's reflected light look thin and sick around it. The shape didn't blink or sway. It simply occupied the reflection as if the glass were the only place it needed to exist. My stomach dropped so suddenly it felt like missing a stair. I snapped my gaze from the doors back to Elias's real body, half expecting to see someone standing behind him in the air of the lobby. There was nothing, just empty space. The orange lamp glow, the brochure rack, the soft clutter of ordinary. But Elias's posture had changed. His shoulders had risen slightly, like he was bracing, and his voice, when he spoke again, wasn't fully calm anymore. The practiced politeness cracked, and something human leaked through. "Don't look at it too long," he whispered, and the word, it carried fear he hadn't allowed himself before. His hand lifted toward the desk, hovering near the curling receipt, as if he wanted to stop it from printing, but didn't dare touch it. "It notices that." "What is it?" I demanded, and the question came out sharper than I intended. Elias flinched at my tone, then swallowed, eyes fixed on the printer like it was the true mouth of whatever stood behind him. "It's not me," he said quickly, and the speed of his answer told me he'd been accused before. "I'm just—" He searched for the right phrasing, and for a moment his face looked like someone trying to translate an impossible concept into simple words. "I'm the checkout that never finished," he said, voice trembling at the edges. "I'm the part that stayed behind when the rest of me—" He stopped, breath hitching, and his gaze flicked again to the glass doors, to the reflection. "It's pulling," he whispered. "It's pulling now." I saw it then, not in the reflection, but in Elias himself. A subtle tension, like an invisible line, had hooked into his back. His jacket shifted without wind, the fabric tugging toward the doors as if the air had currents. His head turned a fraction too slowly, as if something else had a hand on his chin. A faint creak sounded above us, wood or pipe or something repositioning in the ceiling space, and the fluorescent buzz swelled into a harsher pitch that set my teeth on edge. Elias's eyes widened, and the politeness fell away completely. "If you break it," he said, voice urgent now, "you'll scatter it." I didn't fully understand what he meant, but the sentence lit a fuse in me anyway. My gaze snapped to the receipt printer, that small, obedient machine that had started this, that had printed the wrong date and the wrong name, and then acted like it was performing a ritual instead of a transaction. The stapler sat beside it, heavy, metal, the kind that could punch through a stack of paper without effort. My hand moved before my mind could argue. I grabbed the stapler and slammed it down onto the printer's plastic housing. The crack was sharp and ugly, a sound that didn't belong in a quiet lobby. The printer jolted, skidding a few inches across the counter. I hit it again, harder, and felt the plastic give beneath the metal. The thermal paper tore with a dry rip. The machine made a strangled, mechanical squeal, then fell silent. For half a second, the lobby went perfectly still. So still, it felt like the building had turned its face toward me. Then the lights strobed. Not a gentle flicker, a hard, rhythmic on-off that made the room jump in frames. Orange lamp, darkness, brochure rack, void, Elias's pale face, then a smear of shadow. The heater clicked on and off like a faulty switch. My ears filled with a rising electric whine, and underneath it, I heard the wall clock stutter, its tick skipping as if time itself was tripping over the seconds. The monitors blinked, their feeds tearing into horizontal bands. And in those bands, I saw hallway B stretch and fold, doors multiplying, the number 28 repeating like a chant. Elias made a sound that wasn't polite anymore, a raw, startled breath that sounded too alive to be coming from something staid. "No," he rasped, and his hand shot out as if to stop me, then froze midair. His body jerked subtly, like a tug on a wire. His eyes went wide, and for the first time, he looked like a man in danger, not a man asking for help. "You'll scatter it," he said again, but now the words were panic, not warning. "You'll—" His voice broke, and his gaze snapped to the glass doors as if he could see the reflection without looking, because the tall shadow moved, not in the lobby air, not in a place a camera could catch cleanly, but in the glass reflection behind him, sliding closer, swallowing the space around Elias's mirrored outline like ink spreading in water. Elias's real shoulders hunched as if cold had hit him from behind. The rain outside the doors seemed to stop making sound. The fluorescent buzz rose until it was almost a tone. Elias's mouth opened, and his voice came out small and human, the calm finally gone. "Don't!" he pleaded, and it sounded like the beginning of a longer sentence he'd been trying to finish for years. The strobes cut out. Darkness dropped into the lobby so abruptly it felt like the building had shut its eyes. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No hum, no buzz, no rain, no clock. Just a heavy, airless quiet that pressed against my ears. In that blackness, I heard a single soft sound, close to the counter, the faint scrape of paper shifting, as if something were still trying to print. Then in the dark came a sound that made my blood turn cold. A clean, confident beep. It didn't matter that the printer was cracked, its housing split, its paper torn. The beep sounded anyway, certain, satisfied, like a clerk stamping a form approved. The orange lamp flickered back on, weak at first, then steady. The fluorescents returned to their harsh buzz. The heater resumed its hum, as if nothing had happened. Elias was gone from the lobby floor in front of the desk. No footsteps, no door opening, no movement on the monitors to show where he'd gone. Just absence, immediate and complete. And from the broken receipt printer, a thin strip of paper began to slide out, slowly, patiently, as if the machine were perfectly intact. My hand hovered above it, trembling, and every instinct screamed not to look, but my eyes caught the bold, centered line before I could turn away. Dark letters on bright thermal paper, crisp and official. It wasn't Elias Morrow this time. It was my own name, printed with the same bureaucratic certainty as his had been, as if the building had finally decided what I was. In that moment, the truth clicked into place with a clarity that hurt. Elias hadn't been the villain. He'd been the previous item in the ledger, trying to recruit the only tool he had left, a living witness. The real force was the one that printed, the one that counted, the one that turned people into transactions. And now, with one unbroken beep from a broken machine, it had logged me as next. The moment my name appeared on that thin white strip, my body reacted before my mind could form a thought. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I simply froze, with my hand hovering over the broken printer, as if the letters had turned the air into glass. The lobby looked normal in all the ways it had looked normal 1,000 nights before. Orange lamp glow, brochure rack, dull carpet, rain-slick reflections on the glass doors. But it felt staged now, like a set built 1 inch too shallow. My eyes kept snagging on edges, the corner of the counter, the frame of the doors, the straight line of the baseboards. Everything seemed a little too cleanly outlined, as if reality had been printed and laminated and could be peeled back if you caught the seam. The fluorescent buzz overhead held an extra sharpness that made my teeth ache, and the heater's hum sounded less like warmth and more like a machine impersonating warmth. I forced myself to inhale slowly through my nose and exhale through pursed lips, the way you do when you're trying to keep panic from becoming a decision. Don't read it out loud, the tape had warned. I didn't have to read it again. I'd already seen enough to know what it was, but I kept my mouth shut anyway, as if silence could keep my name from becoming official. Time, at least, seemed to behave again. The wall clock ticked forward, 1:13, 1:14, each second-hand jump a small mercy. I stood there until my pulse slowed from a roar to a heavy drumbeat. Then I moved with a kind of careful urgency, not frantic but precise, like someone gathering proof after a crime scene before it can be cleaned. I took the receipt with my name on it and folded it twice without looking at it again, then slid it into the cassette case, as if hiding paper inside plastic could keep it contained. I gathered other receipts too. The ones that had spilled from the printer earlier, the ones I'd found in room 28, stacking them in my hands by feel, resisting the instinct to scan dates. A part of me felt superstitious now, as if eyes were a form of consent. I picked up the VHS tape the machine had spit out and put it back in its case, my thumb smearing dust across the label. Lobby. Night. Then I crouched and retrieved the broken chunks of printer housing from the counter. Cracked plastic, a snapped-off corner, a loose spring that had no business being in a simple thermal printer. I scooped them into a clear zip bag from the supply drawer where we kept spare keycard sleeves and cheap pens. It felt absurdly procedural, like I was inventorying a haunting for a return. I took photos with my phone, the wall clock reading just past 1:12, the broken printer, the curled paper strip, the monitors. I even snapped a picture of the stapler, still sitting where I'd dropped it, because some part of me believed that if I documented every piece, the story couldn't rewrite itself later and tell me it hadn't happened. Sometime between those small motions, the rain outside softened into a lighter, thinner fall. The dark lot began to shift in color, not brightening so much as losing its depth. The vacancy sign still blinked, but its red looked less alive under the paling sky. When dawn threatened the horizon, the motel's sounds changed subtly. The ice machine down the hall ground once, loud and ordinary, and the ordinariness of it made my stomach twist. The coffee pot on the warmer gurgled, an ugly, hollow bubbling sound as stale coffee shifted in heat, and it made me think of a throat clearing in the dark. I flinched at that association, angry at myself, but the motel had trained my brain now. Every sound was a message until proven otherwise. When the first morning birds started up outside, sharp little chirps cutting through the wet air, they sounded too loud, too cheerful, almost aggressive. Their brightness didn't soothe me. It felt like a spotlight thrown over a stage where something was still hiding under the set. By the time the sky turned from ink to bruised gray, the lobby looked almost convincingly normal again. The heaters cycled like they always did. The fluorescent lights held steady without strobing. The monitors showed boring emptiness. If a person walked in at that moment, if a guest came down for coffee, blinking sleep from their eyes, they would have seen only a tired night auditor with a cluttered counter and a too stiff posture. That possibility terrified me more than the darkness had. Normal witnesses would force me to act normal. Normal witnesses would make me doubt my own memory. Normal witnesses would make this feel like a private nightmare instead of a real event. I felt as if I could tear reality with one wrong sentence. I should have left. I knew that. I should have taken my evidence and walked out into the growing daylight and driven until the motel was a shrinking dot in my rearview mirror. But the receipt with my name on it sat in the cassette case like a verdict, and the thought of driving away with my identity printed somewhere in the motel's ledger made my skin crawl. If the building had turned my name into paperwork, then paperwork was the only language it respected. I needed to know what existed on file, what had happened before, who else had been printed, and how long the motel had been doing this. The calm logic of research was the only thing that made me feel slightly less like prey. So I went where the motel kept its paper memory, the back office. The office door stuck the way it always did. I had to shoulder it open. The air inside smelled like dust, old toner, and the faint sweetness of aged paper, archives, and neglect. A single narrow window let in gray morning light that made everything look flat. I flipped on the overhead light, and the room answered with a harsher fluorescent buzz than the lobby, like a higher pitch of the same song. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled in faded marker: guest logs, incidents, maintenance, old receipts. There were binders on a shelf, fat ones with cracked spines, marked by year in thick black ink. I pulled open the cabinet, labeled guest logs, and dust puffed up as if the drawer exhaled. My fingers came away slightly gray. I started with the older binders because Elias's receipt had said 2004, and because the VHS tape's lobby looked like an older version of this place. The binder rings squealed when I opened them, a small metallic complaint that made me pause and listen, half expecting a phone ring or a beep in response. Nothing. Just birds outside and the distant, normal sound of a truck passing on the highway. I flipped through pages of handwritten entries, names and room numbers and rates, all of it mundane enough to lull the mind until it didn't. The handwriting changed from page to page, different clerks, different shifts, the routine of a business that believed it was only a business. I kept going, slower now, letting the dates anchor me. October, early November, the steady march toward the 3rd. My pulse thudded in my ears as if my body already knew what my eyes were about to find. I set the binder aside and opened the filing cabinet labeled Incidents, because traps leave paperwork behind, even when people pretend they don't. Inside were manila folders, each one stamped with a year in thick marker. I pulled out the folder labeled 2004. The tab felt rough under my thumb. For a second I hesitated, struck by the ridiculous thought that opening a folder could be as dangerous as reading a receipt. Then I slid it open. The first sheet on top was an incident report with a name typed in bold near the header: Morrow, Elias. The incident report looked like every other piece of motel paperwork. Typed fields, check boxes, bland language meant to sand down anything sharp. That blandness was what made the name hit harder. Morrow. Elias sat there in bold, official ink, like the building had been waiting 21 years to prove to me that it didn't make mistakes. It made records. My fingers flipped the page with the careful hesitation of someone handling evidence, and the paper made a dry whispering sound in the quiet back office. The report didn't describe anything supernatural. It didn't need to. It used words like unfortunate, incident, liability, and then, almost as an afterthought, November 03rd. I saw the date and felt a hollow drop in my stomach, like an elevator losing its cable for half a second. The file didn't read like a story. It read like a town trying to make a story disappear. I didn't stay in the office long enough to let the motel's fluorescent buzz convince me I was imagining things. I took photos of the header, the date, and the signature line at the bottom, then slid the paper back into the folder with hands that didn't feel fully mine. I gathered what I could carry without looking suspicious. One copy of the incident report, a few receipts with Elias's name and different years, the VHS tape, and the cracked chunks of the printer sealed in the zip bag. I tucked everything into my backpack like I was packing up a crime scene, then stepped out into the lobby as the sky shifted from bruised gray toward weak morning light. Daylight should have made the building feel smaller. Instead, it made everything feel thin. The glass doors reflected the wet lot and blinking red vacancy sign the way they always did. But now, the reflections looked too sharp, as if the world had been laminated. The birds outside were loud in a way that felt almost rude, their chirps slicing through the damp air like little bright knives. The coffee pot gurgled behind the counter, and the sound reminded me of a throat trying to clear itself. I caught myself listening for a beep, and when none came, I didn't relax, because I'd learned that silence could be the building's patience, not its defeat. I locked up as if I were finishing a normal shift. I wrote a brief note for the morning staff that said I'd had equipment issues, because writing my name printed itself would only get me fired or laughed at. Then I got in my car and drove into town with the heater blasting and my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more often than I needed. Every time I blinked, I expected the world to fog and reset and drop me back at the lobby doors. It didn't. The road stayed a road. The same gas station passed once and then disappeared behind me like it should. That fact was reassuring until I realized how quickly my standards for reassurance had changed. I went to the diner first because diners remember things people don't. They sit in the middle of town like a tongue that's tasted everyone's secrets. The place I chose had neon in the window and a bell above the door that rang too brightly for how tired the room felt. Inside, the air smelled like frying oil, coffee, and disinfectant, and the neon hum worked under the conversations like a low electrical purr. A waitress poured coffee into a mug somewhere behind me. Ceramic clink, liquid hiss, and the normalness of the sound made my shoulders drop a fraction. I picked a booth near the window where I could see the street and kept my backpack on the seat beside me, one hand resting on it like it was a live animal. Two older men sat at the counter, shoulders rounded in denim jackets, speaking in the slow cadence of people who had no reason to rush. One of them had the posture of law enforcement even out of uniform, straight-backed, careful, eyes that measured a room before they settled. When the waitress came by, I asked her quietly if he was a deputy. She glanced at him, then at me, and said, "Used to be," in the tone people use when the word used carries a story. She refilled my coffee and moved on, spoon clinking against a saucer like a metronome. I waited until the man stood to pay. Then I approached, with the kind of careful politeness that avoids looking like a reporter. "Sorry," I said. "I work nights at the motel, out by the highway. I had a question." His eyes narrowed slightly, not hostile, just cautious. "Which motel?" he asked. I gave him the name we'd been using, then added quickly, "Names are changed, but you'll know the place," because I'd already decided I wouldn't use real identifiers if this ever became something I told publicly. The man's mouth tightened. He didn't ask why. He just nodded once, slow. "What happened there in 2004? I asked, keeping my voice low enough that it blended into the diner's background noise. The neon hum, the soft scrape of forks, the low murmur of conversations. On November 3rd. The retired deputy didn't answer right away. He slid his change into his pocket, then sat back on the edge of the booth across from me, as if he'd decided this wasn't a 5-second conversation. "You shouldn't go digging in that," he said finally. "I'm already in it. I replied before I could stop myself. The words came out with a flat honesty that surprised me. His gaze held mine, and I saw something shift behind his eyes. Recognition, then a practiced decision to keep his face calm. "They rebuilt it," he said, voice almost casual, like he was commenting on the weather. "After the storm. Some folks say it was a fire, but storms and fires look the same to people who don't want details." He tapped a knuckle lightly on the table, a small sound that lined up with the neon's hum. "It burned hot in one wing. Hallway on the right. Folks got out. Mostly." He paused, and the word mostly hung there like smoke. "And Elias?" I asked. The deputy's mouth tightened. "That name still gets said?" he asked, and his tone carried the same discomfort people have when a grave is mentioned at a party. "He was young, worked there, or stayed there. Depends on which version you hear." He glanced toward the counter where the other man had gone quiet, watching us without pretending not to. "Some say it was an accident," the deputy continued. "Some say it was nobody's fault. Town likes nobody's fault. Lets everyone sleep." He leaned closer, and his voice dropped. "But there's been talk for years. A room that won't release you. A room that keeps a night like it's stuck in a drawer." My skin prickled. "Room 28, I said, and his eyes flicked up sharply, as if I'd said the wrong thing out loud. He didn't confirm it directly. He didn't have to. He exhaled slowly and looked out the window where daylight sat weak and gray on wet pavement. "If you're smart," he said, "you keep your head down. You do your shift. You don't touch what you don't understand." I thought of the printer, of my name, of the tape ejecting itself. "It's not that simple," I said. The deputy studied my face for a long moment, then stood as if he couldn't afford to be seen talking longer. "Library's got the old papers on microfilm," he said, and that was the closest thing to help he offered. "But don't expect the town to remember clean. It doesn't. It remembers in fragments." Then he added, so softly, I almost didn't catch it over the neon hum. "And if you find something that looks like it wants you to read it, don't." The library felt colder than the diner, despite the heat. The AC whispered through ceiling vents, steady and impersonal, like the building was exhaling on a schedule. The carpet swallowed footsteps the way motel carpet does, and the smell was dust and paper and a faint chemical tang from old film. I asked the librarian, an older woman with reading glasses on a chain, about newspapers from 2004. She pointed me toward the microfilm machine without asking why. The way librarians do when they've learned curiosity isn't always kind. The machine whirred when I fed the reel in, a mechanical throat clearing that made me flinch despite myself. The screen glowed, and black and white columns of print slid into view. I scrolled through November issues, eyes skimming headlines about school board meetings, a missing dog, a highway accident, a church fundraiser, ordinary life. I kept going until the date at the top of the page read November 3rd, 2004. My pulse thudded slow and heavy. The page had a short article, small, tucked near the bottom, not front page grief, about an incident at the motel. The language was careful, sanitized, tragic, unfortunate. Authorities declined to comment. The name was there, though. Elias Morrow, spelled cleanly, like the town could bear the name, as long as it was ink on newsprint and not a person in the lobby asking for room 28. I printed a copy, hands unsteady, and as the printer in the library chattered, paper feeding, gears clicking, I felt a ridiculous surge of panic at the sound. Printers had become a language I didn't trust. I forced myself to breathe, folded the warm printout, and tucked it into my backpack without reading it again. Before I left, I checked other years: 2005, 2011, 2020, searching November 3rd like it was a keyword in a database of grief. What I found wasn't a single event repeated, but something subtler. Small references, little incidents, oddities reported, and then never followed up. A disturbance at the motel, an unexplained alarm, a staffing change, the same date appearing like a watermark across different kinds of records. It felt like the town had edited around the day, cutting the sharpest details out and leaving only the outline, hoping that outline would fade with time. But dates don't fade. They just sit there, waiting to be touched. As I stepped out of the library into the gray morning, my phone vibrated, sudden against my palm, loud in my nerves. A text message finally came through, delayed like it had been caught in whatever dead zone the motel created. It was from my manager. Don't read it. I stared at the text on my phone until the words stopped looking like letters and started looking like a command someone had typed with shaking hands. Don't read it. It wasn't, "Are you okay?" or "Call me." It wasn't even, "What happened?" It was an instruction, specific and urgent, as if my manager already knew exactly what I was holding and exactly what it meant. The worst part was how quickly my mind accepted that implication. It didn't even argue. It simply went cold and quiet, the way it does when a terrible possibility becomes the only coherent explanation. I drove back toward the motel with my backpack on the passenger seat, like a fragile thing that might crack open and spill years onto the floor. The town looked normal in daylight. Wet streets, school zone signs, a couple of pickups idling at stoplights, but it felt like a thin set built over something hollow. Even the radio sounded wrong. Too crisp, too cheerful, as if the world were trying to drown out a truth that kept humming beneath it. I turned it off. The car filled with the soft hiss of the heater and the faint thrum of tires on damp pavement. Every time my phone buzzed with a weak signal change, my stomach tightened. I kept expecting the screen to fog, the road to blur, the same building to appear again like a looped exit. It didn't. That should have reassured me. It didn't. My manager's office was attached to the motel, a little square room behind the laundry area that smelled like paper, toner, and old coffee that had been reheated too many times. The door was closed when I arrived, the blinds drawn, the fluorescent light above it spilling an anemic bar of brightness onto the hallway carpet. I knocked once, then again. When no one answered, my knuckles made a dull sound against cheap wood, and in the silence that followed, I thought I heard, faintly, something like a pen scratching on paper from somewhere down hallway B. I told myself it was my imagination. The way you tell yourself, the wind didn't just say your name. The door opened on the second knock. My manager, names changed here too, stood in the gap with her hair pulled back tight and her cardigan buttoned wrong, as if she'd dressed in a hurry. She looked like someone who hadn't slept at all. Her eyes went straight to my backpack, not my face. "You didn't read it," she said immediately. It wasn't a question. Her voice came out flat, strained. "I saw it," I said. I didn't read it out loud. The way I said it made it sound like a superstition, like something you'd say to a friend about not stepping on cracks. But her shoulders loosened a fraction, and that tiny reaction told me it wasn't superstition to her, it was procedure. She stepped aside and let me in. The office was small enough that the air felt used. A cheap desk fan ran in the corner, its blades whispering in a steady, tired loop. The fluorescent light above us buzzed with a higher pitch than the lobby's, a thin electric whine that made my temples ache. File cabinets lined one wall. A corkboard held maintenance notes and staff schedules. Everything about the room screamed ordinary management, ordinary business, except for the way she moved, careful and quick, like someone handling fragile chemicals. "Close the door," she said. I did, and the click sounded louder than it should have. She stayed standing, not offering me a chair. Her gaze flicked once toward the ceiling tiles, then back to me, like she was listening for something above us. I set my backpack on the floor and unzipped it enough that she could see the edge of the VHS case and the zip bag with broken printer pieces. Her face tightened, and for the first time, her composure cracked into something like anger. Anger or fear. They look similar when someone is exhausted. "You went into that room," she said. "It wasn't just a room," I replied, and the words came out sharper than I intended. "You know that. You texted me not to read it. You know exactly what it does." My hands were shaking again, not from cold, but from the dawning shape of betrayal. "How long have you known?" She looked at the desk for a moment, as if the wood grain could give her a script. Then she exhaled and sat, the chair squeaking under her weight. The desk fan continued its soft, repetitive whisper. The fluorescent buzz pressed down. "Longer than you've worked here," she said quietly. "Longer than I've worked here." I pulled a printed copy of the incident report from my bag and slid it onto her desk. The paper made a soft scrape against laminate. "Elias Morrow," I said. "November 3rd, 2004. I kept my voice steady by force. "I found the file in your cabinet." Her eyes flicked to the header and then away, as if the name itself could burn. "We don't say it," she murmured. "You don't say it?" I echoed, incredulous. "But you hire people to work nights. You schedule them. You keep the desk staffed." My throat tightened. "How many?" Her jaw worked. She didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. "I had staff quit suddenly," she said finally, voice thin. "People who left their uniforms in a locker and never came back for their last paycheck. People who drove out of here at dawn and called me from a town 3 hours away, sobbing, swearing they'd never set foot in a motel again." She looked up at me, and the fear in her eyes wasn't theatrical. It was practiced. "And I had gaps," she added. "Shifts no one could explain. Names on schedules that didn't match HR records later. A night auditor who was employed for 6 months, according to the system, but nobody could remember meeting him." Her voice lowered. "Some disappear. Not in a dramatic way, in a paperwork way." My stomach turned. I thought of the receipts scattered across room 28's carpet. The same name printed across different years, like a person turned into an entry. "You knew," I said, and my voice shook now. "And you still hired me." She flinched at that, and the fan's whisper seemed suddenly too loud in the small room. "It's containment," she said quickly, as if she'd been waiting to say the word. "That's what I was told. That's what we're told." She tapped the incident report with one finger without looking at it. After the accident, the town didn't want attention. They didn't want state inspectors. They didn't want questions about what was rebuilt and what was covered up. So they made rules. Quiet rules. The kind that live in staff training and maintenance schedules, not in public ordinances. What rules? I asked, though I already knew some of them. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway, as if the building might hear policy being spoken. Room 28 stays out of order, she said. Always. Even when occupancy is high. Even when we're losing money. It never gets rented, never gets cleaned, never gets fixed. And the front desk printer, she swallowed, it does not run after midnight. We shut it down. We unplug it. We cut power to that outlet if we have to. No receipts printed after 12. No exceptions. She stared at my backpack again. You broke it, she said. And the words weren't accusation so much as horror. And it still printed. A cold, sharp beep sounded from somewhere in the building. Not from the office. Not from the desk printer I'd smashed. Just a clean, confident beep. Faint. Distant. But unmistakable. Like a receipt printer confirming a transaction 2 rooms away. My body reacted instantly. Adrenaline spiking so fast it made my vision sharpen. My manager went pale. For a second, neither of us spoke. The fluorescent buzz filled the silence like a held breath. That, she whispered, voice barely there, is why we contain it. Contain what? I forced out. My mouth felt dry. She looked at me, as if measuring whether telling me would make it worse, and then decided it was already worse. If the checkout completes, she said, it doesn't stay here. Her eyes shone with a miserable kind of certainty. That's what the deputy said back then. That's what the owner's insurance people said without saying. That's what the ones who came after the storm said in private meetings. If it finishes with a living signature, if it closes the transaction cleanly, it migrates, it finds a new desk, a new night person, a new building, with a printer and a clock. Her voice trembled. It stops being a motel problem. It becomes a town problem. I stared at her, the moral shape of it settling into place. So you keep it hungry, I said slowly. Her silence confirmed it. The fan whispered. The fluorescent light buzzed. Somewhere outside the office, a cartwheel squeaked as morning staff moved linens. Ordinary sounds carrying a new, nauseating meaning. My manager's face tightened, and she spoke as if reciting something she hated but had learned by heart. We keep it from completing, she said. We keep room 28 closed. We keep the printer quiet. We keep the night shift staffed, because an empty desk makes it search harder. She lifted her eyes to mine. And we hope it stays localized. You fed it, I said, and the words tasted like metal. With people. She shook her head once, too fast. I didn't, she began, then stopped, because denying it would have been insult. Her voice dropped into something small and honest. I inherited it, she whispered. And I kept the rules because the alternative was outside. She gestured vaguely toward the town, the highway, the world waking up under gray sky. But yes, she admitted, and the confession sat in the room like a bad smell. We kept hiring night auditors. We kept turning over staff. We kept telling ourselves it was just turnover, just burnout, just people who couldn't handle nights. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Because as long as it stayed here, it was contained. The betrayal hit me in a strange, delayed wave. Less anger than a deep, sick understanding. Human bureaucracy turned into ritual. Policies used like wards. Schedules used like offerings. The motel wasn't just haunted, it was managed. It was a containment site, dressed up as a business, and the cost of keeping the entity localized had been paid in quiet resignations, missing names, and people edited out of memory like a date the town refused to hold. My manager's gaze flicked to my backpack one more time. "Don't read it," she repeated, voice urgent. "Don't say it. Don't sign anything. If it has your name now, we have to keep it from finalizing." She leaned forward, and the fan's whisper shivered the loose paper on her desk. "Because once you're logged," she said, "it doesn't just want you to work nights. It wants you to become the next line in the ledger." And somewhere in the building, faint, satisfied, bureaucratically calm, that clean little beep sounded again, as if something had just stamped my life approved. I didn't sleep that day. I tried. Curtains closed, phone face down, the kind of exhausted collapse that normally knocks me out after a night shift. But every time I drifted, I heard the clean little beep in the back of my mind, and I saw my name on bright thermal paper, like a tag tied to a toe. By late afternoon, I stopped pretending and turned the restlessness into something useful. If the motel was going to treat paperwork like ritual, then the only way to fight it was with procedure. Cold, deliberate, boring procedure. Not candles and chants. Checklists. Rules. A refusal so consistent it couldn't be misfiled. I met my manager briefly before sunset. Not to argue anymore. There wasn't time for anger, but to extract what she knew, like a technician pulling error codes from a failing system. She gave me the same rules again, tighter this time, as if she believed repetition could reinforce them. Don't let the printer run after midnight. Never rent room 28. Never read the printed line out loud. Never sign anything that comes from that machine. When she said the word sign, her eyes flicked toward my mouth as if even speaking the word could tempt fate. I didn't tell her about the idea forming in my head yet. I didn't say the part that felt most dangerous. If it wanted my identity, then the fight wasn't to destroy the room. It was to refuse being named by it, to deny it the anchor point it needed to complete the transaction. Back at my place, I laid everything out on the kitchen table, like I was packing for a job that required tools instead of courage. The motions calmed me, not because they solved anything, but because they gave my hands something to do other than shake. First, gloves. Thick nitrile, the kind that doesn't tear easily. I'd spent the whole day thinking about touch, how the tape warned me not to read, how Elias said the printer wanted recognition, how a receipt felt warm like it had been alive. Gloves meant distance, a layer between me and the paper. Next, tape. Not the motel's cheap transparent tape, but real duct tape and painter's tape. Something that could seal a drawer, cover a screen, mark a boundary on the floor. Then a lighter, simple and reliable, and a small metal tray from the kitchen. Something to burn paper in without turning my plan into a fire alarm. Marker. Thick black, the kind that bleeds certainty into whatever it touches. A blank name tag I'd picked up from an office supply store. White plastic, no name printed, no history attached. And an analog watch, cheap and plain, because I didn't trust any clock that could be set by a system. I wanted time I could hear, a tiny mechanical tick against my wrist, a private metronome. I packed slowly, listening to the sounds, because sound had become a language in this story, whether I wanted it or not. The zipper rasped like teeth. The duct tape tore with a low, violent rip that made me pause, heart tightening, until I reminded myself it was just tape. The gloves crinkled softly, a dry whisper. When I dropped the lighter into the bag, it clinked against the metal tray with a clean chime that sounded too much like a key turning in a lock. I stood there in the kitchen's ordinary light and tried to keep my breathing even because my brain had started pairing harmless noises with dread. The only way to undo that pairing was to stay calm through it, teach my body a new response. Then I wrote the protocol. I didn't type it. I didn't want it living in my phone, where it could be edited, erased, or mysteriously lost. I wrote it on paper, with a pen that clicked loudly when I pressed it, and every click felt like a small act of commitment. The sound of the tip on the page, scratch, 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 made my skin prickle because it echoed what I'd heard behind the wall in room 28. I forced myself to keep writing anyway, turning the motif into my own. If something in that room was logging reality, then I would log my refusal. The checklist was simple on purpose, blunt enough to survive panic. Do not read any printed name. Not on receipts. Not on screens. Not on the monitor feeds if text appears. Do not speak your own name out loud inside the building. Not to the phone. Not to yourself. Not in anger. Not in prayer. Do not sign anything. Do not initial. Do not confirm. If asked, answer with silence or a non-name sound. If paper prints, handle only with gloves. Fold inward. Do not scan it. Treat it like contaminated evidence. If the printer beeps, step back. Do not respond verbally. Do not look for the meaning. Track time with the analog watch only. Do not trust wall clocks. Do not trust phone time. If the loop begins, do not attempt exits. Exits are part of the script. Stay inside the protocol. I read the checklist once, silently, eyes moving over the words without speaking them. Then I wrote it again, smaller, on an index card that could fit in my pocket. I added one final line at the bottom in thick marker, the ink smelling sharp and chemical. No name, no signature, no checkout. To make it feel real, to future-proof it against the gaslighting I knew exhaustion could do, I recorded audio notes. Not a dramatic confession, not a ghost story performance, just clean documentation, the way you'd record a work incident for HR. I spoke into my phone in a steady voice, careful to avoid saying my own name, careful even with pronouns, as if identity itself could be snagged by language. I described the printer beep, the receipt dates, the VHS tape labeled Lobby Night, the man on the tape warning me, the manager admitting containment. I said that names and identifying details were changed because I didn't want anyone who listened later to mistake this for a real accusation against a real town. Then I ended the recording with the protocol, read aloud in the same calm tone, like a flight attendant explaining emergency exits, except this time the emergency was paperwork. By the time the sun went down, my body felt hollowed out, tired but wired, fear held in place by planning. I drove back to the motel with the backpack on the seat beside me, my hand resting on it at stoplights like it might move on its own. The town looked softer at night. Porch lights, wet streets reflecting yellow. Yet I couldn't shake the sense that all of it was staged around one specific date, one specific minute. I parked, sat for a moment, and listened to my analog watch tick. That small sound was oddly comforting. It didn't beep. It didn't print. It didn't ask for a signature. It just counted. Inside the lobby, everything looked almost normal again. The orange lamp glowed. The brochures waited. The vacancy sign buzzed in the window like a tired insect. The heater hummed, then clicked off and on, as it always did. If you didn't know what the building did with names, You could have believed it was just another quiet motel on a rainy night. I set my backpack under the counter, taped the protocol card to the inside of the register cabinet where only I could see it, and put the gloves within easy reach. The last thing I did before midnight was cover the receipt printer with a strip of duct tape, not to bind a spirit, not to do anything mystical, but to create a physical interruption. A reminder to my hands: don't touch this, don't interact, don't participate. The analog watch on my wrist ticked toward 1:11. I kept my eyes off the wall clock as long as I could, but at some point, like an itch you finally scratch, I looked up. The lobby clock's second hand moved, then hesitated. Just for a fraction, barely a stutter, right as it approached 1:11, as if the building were deciding whether to let the next minute happen. The clock's hesitation at 1:11 was so slight, I could have blamed it on tired eyes. I didn't. I felt it the way you feel a shift in pressure before a storm breaks, a quiet tightening in the room that makes your lungs work a little harder. I looked away from the clock immediately and fixed my attention on the analog watch at my wrist. Its tiny tick was clean, stubborn, private. I counted with it, 60 seconds in a minute, one foot planted on the carpet, shoulders loose on purpose, hands resting flat on the counter like I was teaching my body a new definition of normal. The lobby's heater clicked off at 1:11:30, right on schedule, as if the building had been waiting for a cue. The fluorescent buzz above me grew louder, climbing from background noise to a thin, irritating tone. Outside, the rain softened in that listening way again, not stopping, just quieting, as if the weather itself didn't want to interrupt. I reached under the counter and touched the pocket card through my jeans. No name, no signature, no checkout. My fingers found the edge of the nitrile gloves and held there, ready. At 1:12, the duct tape over the receipt printer lifted. Not dramatically, not ripped free by force. It simply peeled itself upward from one corner with a slow, patient curl, like a label relaxing in heat. The motion was small enough to be plausible, and that plausibility was the trap. My mind tried to accept it as physics. My body rejected it. The tape continued peeling until it hung from the printer like a loose tongue. Then came the beep. A clean, confident beep. The same sound I'd heard on the tape. The same sound that had started all of this. Except I had unplugged the printer hours ago. I'd pulled the plug from the outlet and taped the cord to the underside of the counter so it couldn't accidentally reconnect. I knew where it was. I'd checked it twice, because this was the kind of night where you check everything twice. The beep sounded anyway. I didn't look at the printer slot. I stared at the register screen, at the dull gray interface that had no reason to change, and I counted 5 breaths the way I'd practiced. In, 2, 3, out, 2, 3. The analog watch ticked. Somewhere behind the desk, paper began to move. Not a normal feed from a machine. A soft, dry whisper, like thin skin sliding over plastic. Out of the corner of my eye, something white curled into the air. Too clean, too bright in the dim lobby. Rising from the printer slot as if the printer were still alive. As if the outlet meant nothing. I kept my gaze forward and let my peripheral vision confirm what I already knew. The strip was coming. It wanted to be seen. It wanted my eyes to lock onto it. Wanted the reflexive act of reading to complete the circuit. The phone rang, not the desk phone. My personal phone in my pocket, vibrating with an incoming call, even though it had shown no service for hours. The vibration was muffled by fabric, but insistent, intimate, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me. I pulled it out and saw the caller ID, front desk. That wasn't possible. My phone didn't have that contact. I'd never saved it. The screen glowed too bright against the lobby darkness. I let it ring twice, then answered without raising it to my ear, holding it out in front of me on speaker, the way you might hold a bite of food you don't trust. "Hello," I said quietly, and immediately regretted giving it a word to work with. There was a pause. Then my own voice came through the speaker. Not a perfect mimic, not a movie trick. Subtle, slightly flattened, like an old recording played back through a bad speaker. It said the same phrase I'd used 100 times at the desk, in my cadence, with my tired politeness. Red Cedar Motor Lodge, front desk. The sound made my stomach twist. It wasn't threatening. It was worse than threatening. It was familiar. It was me turned into a prompt. I stayed silent. The protocol card in my pocket felt hot. The speaker hissed with faint static. Then my voice tried again, softer, coaxing. "Can I have your name?" The line held the shape of a normal interaction, gentle and professional, and that gentleness was the blade. Because answering would be participation. Even refusing out loud could be participation if it dragged my identity into the air. Behind me, from the direction of hallway B, came the slow, deliberate clunk of a vending machine button being pressed and held. One clunk, a pause, another clunk. The pattern felt like a code someone was tapping through a wall. Patient, sure, practiced. The temperature in the lobby dropped just enough that my forearms prickled. The copper taste returned at the back of my throat. I slid the phone face down on the counter without hanging up, as if denying it my attention could starve it. The call stayed connected anyway. The faint hiss continued like a breath. Above me, something thudded in the ceiling. One heavy bang, then a smaller creak, like weight shifting across rafters. Dust drifted from a seam in the ceiling tile and floated through the lamp glow. The monitors flickered. For a moment, the hallway B feed darkened, then sharpened. The corridor looked longer than it should. Colder. The doors at the far end seemed to repeat for an instant, like a mirror trick. I didn't stare. I wouldn't give it that. I lowered my eyes to my watch and counted ticks, forcing my attention into something mechanical and honest. That was when Elias appeared, not with a dramatic entrance. He was simply there near the glass doors, the way he had been before, rain-beaded jacket, old name tag. Except now, he looked less stable, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. The edges of his outline seemed to soften and then reassert, his posture wavering between standing and being held upright. His reflection in the glass lagged more than half a second now. Sometimes it didn't match him at all, as if the building couldn't keep his image synchronized. He took a step, and the motion looked slightly delayed, like the frames of him weren't arriving in the right order. His face wasn't polite tonight. It was strained, pinched with effort, eyes too bright. When he spoke, his voice carried a tremor he'd hidden before. "You shouldn't be here," he said, and the sentence sounded like both warning and apology. "It's writing faster." I didn't answer. I lifted my gloves slowly and slid them on, the nitrile snapping softly at my wrists. Elias's gaze flicked to the curling receipt strip and back to my face. He swallowed hard. "Don't look," he whispered, and I heard real fear in it. Fear not for me alone, but for himself, like my failure would tighten his leash. The TV on the dresser, off since I'd arrived, clicked on by itself. The screen filled with static, then shifted to a brief, too clear image. A kitchen that looked like mine, light from a window, a mug on a counter. The kind of ordinary scene that makes you feel exposed because it means you've been observed. The shot changed. Another angle, another room. Something like a living room, a couch, blurred figures that might have been people I cared about, not in detail, not enough to be exploitative, just enough to make my chest tighten with the instinct to protect. The image was silent, but the silence itself felt engineered. The voice on my face-down phone softened into something almost kind. "Just confirm," it murmured through the speaker hiss. "Just sign." The word landed like a hook. Elias flinched, shoulders tightening. "It's trying to make you grab it," he whispered. "If you read it, it counts." The ceiling banged again, harder, and the fluorescent lights flickered once, just once, like an eyelid twitching. The VCR whirred in the corner, without a tape inserted, a mechanical throat clearing that rose and fell like a breath. The paper from the broken printer tore slightly, and the sound amplified unnaturally, ripping loud in the quiet, like fabric being torn right next to my ear. I closed my eyes for a full second and did what I'd practiced. Inhale, count. Exhale, count. I placed my gloved hand flat on the counter away from the printer, grounding myself in texture. I kept my voice small and neutral when I finally spoke, careful to avoid anything that could be used as identity. "No," I said. One syllable. No name. No explanation. No negotiation. The receipt strip advanced another inch, curling toward me like it was reaching. I forced my eyes to stay on the blank laminate of the counter, but the thermal paper's brightness pulled at my vision like gravity. In that tug, I saw the top line as it emerged. Dark letters, crisp, official, a first name, a last name, the full shape of my identity laid out in ink like a claim. I didn't read it. I refused to let my mind sound it out. But the spacing, the capital letters, the familiar length of it made my stomach drop with certainty. It was printing my full name, slowly, cleanly, almost readable from where I stood. The paper kept advancing in slow, obedient inches, curling toward me like it had weight and intention. The top line was already dark, with letters I refused to assemble in my mind. I kept my eyes on the laminate edge of the counter, on a tiny nick in the surface, on the faint reflection of the orange lamp. Anything but the printed stroke pattern that my brain wanted to recognize. The phone on the counter continued to hiss softly on speaker. My own recorded politeness trying to coax a response out of me. "Just confirm," it murmured through the static, as if the whole night could be reduced to a checkbox. I slid my gloved hand into my pocket and touched the blank name tag. Smooth plastic, no ink, no field filled. A small, stupid object, and yet my fingers tightened around it like it was a key. The motel wanted identity the way it wanted dates. Clean, formatted, legible. It wanted me to become an entry. I pulled the tag out and held it up between my eyes and the curling receipt like a shield. Not because it blocked anything, but because it reminded me of the point. I clipped it onto my shirt, right over where my actual work badge sat, covering the printed letters completely. The click sounded loud in the listening hush of the lobby. The blank rectangle looked ridiculous against the uniform, an omission where a label should be. But the moment it settled, something in the air shifted, almost imperceptibly, like a bureaucratic system encountering an empty required field. Elias, standing near the doors, edges wavering, reflection lagging and glitching, watched that blank tag as if it were a language he'd forgotten he could speak. His mouth opened, then closed again. The polite guest mask tried to return and failed. What remained was raw fatigue and fear. That's not allowed," he whispered, but the tremor in his voice sounded hopeful as much as terrified. Above us, the ceiling banged once, heavy and impatient, and dust sifted down in the lamp glow. The receipt strip twitched, advanced another fraction. The printer's slot was cracked, unplugged, taped, broken, and still, the paper came as if from empty space, as if the building itself had become the machine. I didn't argue with it. I didn't plead. I did what you do with contaminated evidence. I contained it. Keeping my eyes down and unfocused, I reached with two gloved fingers and pinched the paper near the bottom where it was still mostly blank, careful not to drag my gaze across the top line. The thermal paper felt strangely warm through the glove, as if it had just been born. I folded it inward on itself once, then again, hiding the printed face the way you'd hide a wound. I didn't let the letters touch air. I didn't let my mind complete them into sound. The lighter and the small metal tray were already waiting under the counter. I set the folded receipt into the tray without unfolding it. The motion was slow and deliberate, like placing something fragile into a cradle. The lobby's fluorescent buzz climbed higher, sharper, and the TV static swelled in the corner, as if the room was raising its voice to drown out my silence. My phone speaker hissed. Then my own voice, flattened and wrong, asked again, "Can I have your name?" I didn't answer. I didn't even look at the screen. I flicked the lighter once. The spark sounded huge in the hush. On the second flick, flame caught and steadied. A small orange tongue that moved with a calm confidence the motel's darkness couldn't imitate. I brought it close to the folded paper. The receipt didn't ignite right away. Thermal paper doesn't burn like a dry leaf. It resists, then gives in. The corner curled, darkened, and then the flame took, producing a soft, crackling whisper that reminded me of that scratch-scratch motif. Only warmer, final. The smell hit next, sharp and chemical, like hot plastic and scorched dust. Unpleasant and unmistakably real. The paper curled tighter as it burned, shrinking away from its own printed meaning. A thin ribbon of gray smoke rose and twisted under the ceiling light like a question mark. The building reacted as if I'd slapped it. The heater under the counter clicked on, then off, then on again in a stuttering rhythm. The fluorescent lights flickered, not a full strobe like before, but a nervous flutter, as if the lobby was blinking hard. The vending machine down hallway B clunked twice in quick succession, a coded complaint. My phone speaker hissed louder, and behind the hiss, I heard a deeper static. The VHS kind. The sound of old recordings refusing to stay stable. Somewhere in the back of the motel, a door latch rattled as if tested from the other side. Elias flinched, one hand lifting to his chest. For a split second, his outline sharpened. More solid, less erased. And I saw relief spread across his face like warmth. Then fear chased it immediately. His gaze snapped to the glass doors, to the black pane that held reflections like a second ledger. "It's going to pull," he warned, voice breaking. "It doesn't like missing fields." In the glass, the tall shape gathered again, not in the air, but in the reflection, where the rules were looser. It pressed close behind him, too close, overlapping his reflected shoulders like a shadow claiming ownership. Elias's real body jerked subtly, as if a hook had tightened. His reflection lagged, then blurred, then snapped back a fraction too far behind him. He made a sound through his teeth, human pain without spectacle. I stepped forward, keeping my eyes off the glass, and focused instead on the blank tag pinned to my chest, on the refusal it represented. I spoke only in the smallest, safest words. "No," I said. To the lobby, to the printer, to the thing that wanted a neat row in its ledger. Then I looked at Elias's mouth, not his tag, and addressed him without naming him, because names were handles, and this place loved handles. "You," I said, steady. "Step toward me." He hesitated, as if waiting for permission from something behind him. The shadow in the reflection seemed to swell, thickening, pushing. The fluorescent buzz rose into a thin, angry pitch. The ceiling creaked, as if weight shifted above us. The phone on the counter began to repeat my voice in a softer tone, almost pleading now, almost kind, trying to lure me into normal conversation, trying to make me say the one word that would make me legible again. I refused. I watched my analog second-hand tick. I counted under my breath without using any name, without using any "I am." 1, 2, 3. Then I moved. Fast, not violent. I went to the small maintenance panel we kept behind the desk, the one that controlled a few non-essential circuits, the one my manager had shown me during training with a shrug and a warning about tripping alarms. I didn't think of it as a technical fix. I thought of it as rhythm. I toggled the power for a heartbeat, just long enough for the lobby lights to dip and return. And in that brief interruption, the wall clock above the brochures skipped, its second hand lurching forward like it had been startled awake. I did it again a moment later, timed to my watch, a deliberate pattern that broke the motel's smooth loop and replaced it with my own cadence. Human breath, human counting, human refusal. The effect wasn't cinematic, but it was real. The room's listening hush cracked. The rain outside resumed its ordinary sound, uncurious. The fluorescent buzz dropped half a pitch. The printer's slot, still cracked, stopped feeding paper for the first time all night, as if it had lost its script mid-sentence. Elias staggered forward, one step, then another, like someone walking out of deep water. The tall shape in the glass surged, trying to keep him aligned with its claim, but something had changed. His reflection caught up. The lag lessened, then vanished. For the first time since I'd seen him, his reflected body matched his real one in timing and posture, as if the glass could no longer misfile him. His shoulders rose on a shaky inhale. His eyes filled with a kind of stunned relief that looked almost childlike. He glanced at my blank name tag and gave a small, disbelieving shake of his head, like he'd never considered the option of being no one in the motel's paperwork. "It feeds on it," he whispered, voice raw. "Not blood, not souls. It. Acknowledgement. Reading. Signing. Naming." He swallowed hard and looked toward the tray, where the last curl of receipt paper collapsed into a delicate gray ash. "You burned the anchor." The shadow in the glass did not disappear, not entirely. It hovered, frustrated, deprived of purchase. But it felt less like an owner now, and more like an accountant confronted with a form it couldn't process. No signature, no confirmed identity, no valid transaction to close. The lobby held its breath one last time, waiting for me to give in and make it easy. I didn't. I kept my mouth closed around every name the building wanted from me. I stood with my blank tag on my chest, the ash cooling in the tray, my analog watch ticking on my wrist, and I let the silence become my answer. Dawn didn't arrive with a dramatic break in the sky. It seeped in the way water seeps into dry ground. Slow, patient, almost polite. The gray outside the glass doors lightened into a washed-out blue, and the parking lot stopped looking like black glass and started looking like wet asphalt again. The sodium lights clicked off one by one, their orange cast fading, and for the first time in hours, the lobby felt like it belonged to the daytime world. Ordinary, a little shabby, almost embarrassing, like a set you've seen backstage with the lights on. The heater under the counter cycled the way it always did, thumping on with that familiar dull sound and then settling into a warm hum. The fluorescent buzz softened to its usual irritating background. The rain turned into a steady, honest patter instead of that listening hush. Somewhere on the highway, a semi passed, and the low rush of tires on wet pavement sounded strangely comforting. I stood behind the desk, with my blank name tag still clipped to my shirt, my gloved hands resting flat on the counter, and I let my body relearn the idea that nothing was about to jump out of the seams. Elias was gone. Not yanked away with strobes or darkness or a dramatic sound. He was simply not there. No figure by the doors, no delayed reflection, no tired politeness held together by fear. The space where he had stood looked empty in the unromantic way empty spaces usually look. It reminded me of a cleared checkout lane at a grocery store. Nothing left on the belt, no one waiting, just a quiet that says the transaction is finished. For a moment, I felt something that surprised me. Grief. Not for a man I'd known, not for a friend, but for the tired human shape of him. For the sense that he'd been trapped in a system that could only recognize him as ink on paper. His absence wasn't victory. It was release. My manager arrived just after the sky turned bright enough to show the motel's flaws in detail. She came in through the front doors instead of the back, as if she didn't trust staff entrances anymore. Her face looked hollowed out, eyes rimmed with sleepless red, hair still pulled too tight. She froze when she saw me behind the desk. Then her gaze flicked to the broken printer, to the metal tray, to the faint smudge of ash, and finally to the blank name tag on my chest. Something in her expression collapsed, shock first, then a terrible understanding. "You're still," she began, then stopped, like she didn't know which words were safe. She swallowed and lowered her voice. "Did it?" Her eyes darted to the lobby, as if the building might be listening even now. I shook my head once, small, controlled. "No names," I said quietly, keeping it procedural even in daylight. "No signatures, no reading." She closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, they were wet. She didn't cry. She looked like someone standing in front of an open file cabinet full of guilt. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words came out flat because she'd probably been saying them in her head for years, and none of them had ever felt like enough. She moved behind the counter, slower than usual, and sat in the chair as if she didn't trust her legs. The desk fan in the office clicked on somewhere in the back, its whispering loop faint through the hallway, and for a second, the sound made me tense until I remembered. It was just a fan, just air. I kept telling myself it was protecting the town, she said, staring at her hands. Protecting the highway, protecting people who didn't even know what was near them. She swallowed hard, but it was really just keeping it out of sight, keeping it out of my conscience. keeping it in this building, so the problem looked like turnover and bad luck. Her voice cracked on the last phrase. I hired people anyway, she added, and it wasn't a defense. It was a confession. Outside, the birds kept chirping, too loud and too alive. The sound wasn't aggressive now. It was simply birds being birds. A car door slammed somewhere in the lot, and the blunt normality of it made my shoulders drop. Sunlight began to break through a thin tear in the clouds, and a weak, warm stripe slid across the lobby carpet, lighting up dust and worn fibers and the faded brochure rack like it belonged in a cheap commercial. The light made the whole night feel unreal for a second, like I could have been exaggerating it in my own head. But then I caught the faint chemical smell lingering near the tray, the memory of thermal paper curling into flame, and I remembered. Reality can be ordinary in the morning and still be true at night. What are you going to do? I asked, and the question wasn't just about the motel. It was about the years behind it, about the names that had vanished into schedules and ledgers and never been spoken again. My manager's jaw tightened. She looked older in daylight than she had the night before. I can't keep it open, she said finally. Not like this. She rubbed her palms together as if trying to erase a feeling. I can report it, at least the incident history, the rebuild paperwork, the equipment failures. A bitter, almost laugh escaped her, sharp with shame. That's the only language anyone will accept until it isn't. She looked at the broken printer again and flinched. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I can put it on record. I can stop pretending the record is harmless. Her words settled over me like a blanket that was both comfort and weight. The town's complicity hadn't been a single villain. It had been a chain of small decisions, filed and refiled until nobody felt responsible. I thought about the prior night auditors, the ones who quit suddenly, the ones who disappeared in paperwork ways, the ones whose names might exist only on receipts in a room that shouldn't exist. I felt a slow, deep compassion rise in place of pure fear. Not because fear was gone, but because fear had finally found a shape large enough to include other people. This wasn't just a monster story, it was an administrative horror. A system that used politeness and procedure to take what it wanted. By the time the sun warmed the glass doors, the motel looked so normal it almost hurt. The vacancy sign blinked, tired red in daylight. The brochure rack offered attractions nobody visited. The coffee pot gurgled and then went quiet. I stood there and felt the strangest kind of relief, my body unclenching in increments, like a fist opening finger by finger. Warmth in my hands, air that didn't taste like pennies, a heartbeat that didn't feel monitored. I reached into my pocket to pull out the protocol card, to make sure it was still there, to prove to myself I hadn't dreamed the whole night. My fingers touched something else first, thin, smooth, folded, a receipt strip. For a second, my stomach dropped, muscle memory firing like an alarm. I pulled it out slowly. It was a narrow piece of thermal paper, curled and blank, the kind that could have come from any motel printer at any time. I held it up in the morning light and saw no ink, no date, no room number, no name, nothing printed at all. Just a clean, empty strip that smelled faintly of warmth and paper. It should have reassured me. Instead, it left me with a quiet, unsettling question that sat in my chest like a pebble you can't swallow. If the motel's horror feeds on acknowledgement, on naming, signing, agreeing, then how much of our lives do we hand over every day without noticing? Not to ghosts or shadows, but to systems that want us legible, filed, processed. How many times do we accept a label, answer a prompt, confirm an identity because it's easier than resisting? I folded the blank strip once and slid it back into my pocket. I didn't burn it. I didn't throw it away. I kept it the way you keep a scar. Proof that something happened. And a reminder that the scariest thing in that motel hadn't been darkness or a shadow behind glass. It had been the moment something asked for a name, and I almost gave it. I didn't finish that shift. Not in the way the motel would have wanted. No neat handoff. No everything's fine smile for a daytime clerk. No smooth continuation of the routine. When the morning staff arrived, I stayed just long enough to make sure my manager couldn't pretend it hadn't happened, and then I left my keys in the drawer and walked out into the weak sunlight like a person stepping off a moving belt. I didn't look back at the building from the parking lot. I didn't want the glass to catch me and turn my reflection into another line item. Quitting didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet. It felt like unclenching. The first week afterward, my body kept waking at 1:12 without permission. Not with a nightmare, not with a scream. Just my eyes opening in the dark, heart steady but alert, as if my nervous system still believed a clock could decide my identity. I'd lie there listening to the house settle, the soft tick of cooling pipes, the distant wash of traffic, the occasional refrigerator cycle clicking on. Normal sounds, honest sounds, the kind that used to lull me. For a while, they all sounded like warnings. Then, slowly, they stopped. Or maybe I stopped assigning them meaning. Either way, sleep returned in cautious installments. I found a day job, nothing glamorous. A warehouse office, regular hours. A supervisor who cared more about punctuality than personality. The first time I clocked in at 9 and left at 5, it felt like cheating. My world shrank to predictable routines. Coffee in the morning, lunch at noon, sunlight that belonged to the hours I was awake. The simple stability was a kind of medicine. I didn't tell my new coworkers why I flinched when a receipt printer squealed at the shipping desk, or why I stood too far back whenever paper fed out with that warm curl. I learned to laugh it off. I learned to breathe through it. The sound became a memory trigger instead of a jump scare. An echo of a night I'd survived, not a doorway back into it. I didn't let the story stay private, though. That would have been the final way the motel won, by turning it into something that existed only in my head. Something easy to dismiss as stress or exhaustion. In the weeks after, I copied what I had. The photos of the clock at 1:12, the incident report header, the newspaper clipping, the receipts I'd handled without reading aloud. I made a duplicate of the VHS tape by converting it, carefully, into a digital file, so it couldn't disappear the way paperwork disappears when no one asks questions. I wrote a statement that sounded like a workplace complaint, not a ghost story, because I understood now that the world has categories for things it can digest. Equipment malfunction, unsafe working conditions, missing incident reporting, staff retention concerns. I changed names and identifying details, not to protect the motel, but to protect the truth from turning into gossip. Then I mailed a packet to the county office that handled inspections and licensing. I sent another to a journalist at a regional paper, the kind of person who covers municipal budgets and bad contractors and small-town accountability, not paranormal clickbait. I included a note that said, plainly, that I understood how unbelievable it sounded, and that I didn't expect a supernatural conclusion, only an investigation into why a property had a paper trail of incidents that never led anywhere. I also recorded an audio confession, clean, steady, first person, because I'd learned that memory can be edited by exhaustion and time, and I wanted my own voice preserved before it could be filed away and forgotten. If nothing else, I wanted a record that I hadn't agreed to disappear. The strangest part was how the motel started to feel like a metaphor only after I got distance from it. In the middle of it, there had been no symbolism, just cold air, paper, a clock that wouldn't behave. But afterward, as my sleep steadied and my hands stopped trembling, I kept thinking about the way the whole horror had been built out of ordinary systems. A desk, a printer, a policy, a manager's rules, forms that demanded names, lines that asked for signatures, prompts that assumed participation as the default. The motel hadn't needed claws or fangs. It had needed my cooperation. The monster hadn't been a demon in the walls. It had been a process that treated acknowledgement like consent and identity like property. That idea followed me into daylight life in small ways. When someone tried to rush me into signing a form without reading it, I slowed down. When a company asked for data that felt unnecessary, I paused. When a person pushed for a version of me that didn't fit, I practiced saying no without justifying it. Boundaries, I realized, are a kind of refusal to be processed. Not everything that asks for your name deserves it. Not everything that wants a piece of you has the right to file it away. Months passed. The inspector's office replied with a letter full of careful language and promises to review the matter. The journalist emailed twice, polite and non-committal, asking for clarifications that made it clear they believed the paperwork more than they believed me. My manager texted once to say the motel might be sold, and then nothing. Life moved on the way life does, indifferent to the mysteries that almost swallow it. My sleep improved. My face looked less hollow in the mirror. My body started trusting mornings again, and still, every so often, when I heard a clean little beep in a store aisle or behind a counter, something in my chest tightened for a half second, like an old scar, remembering pressure. I'd breathe through it. I'd remind myself where I was. I'd keep walking. Then, one quiet night, long after I'd convinced myself the worst of it had turned into memory, I woke up at home with no dream attached. The house was still. The street outside was empty. My bedroom was dark except for the faint glow of my analog watch on the nightstand, its hands steady, honest. And from somewhere in the house, soft, precise, unmistakably confident, came a single, unfamiliar beep. Not loud, not dramatic, just clean, certain, and final enough to make my breath catch, as if someone, somewhere, had just printed a line and was waiting to see if I would read it. The beep didn't repeat. That was what made it dangerous. The restraint. A loud noise would have belonged to an appliance, a glitch, a neighbor's car alarm. This was a single clean sound placed into silence with intention, like a finger tapping once on a desk to get your attention and then waiting to see if you'll look up. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening. The house was quiet in the familiar ways that used to soothe me. The refrigerator hum in the kitchen, cycling like a distant engine. The faint tick of my analog watch on the nightstand. The HVAC thumping on in the walls with that dull, comforting punch that says warm air is coming. Outside, a far-off car moved through wet streets, tires whispering briefly and then fading. It was the same calm bass line I described in that motel lobby months ago. The same ordinary sound bed that tells your body it's safe to sleep. But safety, I'd learned, can be mimicked. I didn't move toward the sound. I didn't sit up and go hunting for a source like a curious teenager in a horror movie. I kept my body flat against the mattress and focused on breathing, slow and even, the way you do when your nervous system is trying to sprint, but you refuse to let it. In, 2, 3, out, 2, 3. I let the air fill my lungs like warm water, and I told myself something that felt absurdly simple and yet hard-earned. Curiosity is not neutrality. In certain places, certain systems, curiosity is participation. The refrigerator clicked, paused, and then resumed its hum. The HVAC gave a soft whoosh. Nothing else. No footsteps. No whisper on the phone line. No strobing lights. I waited long enough that my heartbeat stopped pounding and returned to a steady, heavy rhythm. Then I heard it. Not a second beep. Not a voice. Paper. A faint, dry movement from somewhere beyond my bedroom door. Soft enough that if I hadn't been listening so carefully, I might have mistaken it for fabric settling or a branch tapping a window. It was the particular whisper of thin paper sliding over itself, like a receipt curling as it feeds out of a printer, warm at the edge, stiff in the middle. It lasted only a second, then stopped, as if whatever made it had decided to be polite and not rush me. My mouth went dry. My mind offered me a dozen rational explanations. Draft from a vent, a grocery bag shifting, a receipt left on the counter catching a current of air. Normal things, harmless things, and maybe that's all it was. Maybe it always was. The problem was that my body recognized patterns now. A printer beep isn't just a beep once you've lived through a night where a beep meant your name. I lay there and thought about the rule I'd written like a checklist and then rewritten into my bones. Don't read. Don't sign. Don't name. Those weren't magic words. They were boundaries. They were the simplest form of non-consent in a world that assumes your agreement if you respond quickly enough. I didn't get up immediately. That was the choice. The old version of me, the night auditor who believed routine could tame anything, would have gone to check, because checking is what you do when you're responsible. You check the doors. You check the locks. You check the machine that beeped when it shouldn't. You check because your job is to respond. And the world rewards responders with the illusion of control. But I wasn't behind a motel desk anymore. I wasn't paid to answer prompts. I wasn't obligated to complete a transaction just because something asked. So I stayed still and let the silence be my first response. After a minute, I reached out and turned on the lamp beside my bed. The warm light filled the room in a soft pool, gentle and ordinary. It didn't banish fear, like a switch in a movie. It just reminded my eyes what my life looked like now. A worn nightstand, a folded sweater on a chair, the steady hands of my analog watch, time moving the way time is supposed to move. The light made the dark corners less persuasive. I sat up, swung my feet to the floor, and did not walk out to hunt for paper. Instead, I opened my notebook. It was the same kind of spiral notebook I'd used to write the protocol, the same familiar scratch of pen on paper that had once made my skin crawl because it echoed the sound behind room 28's wall. Now, I let the sound belong to me. I clicked the pen. I listened to to the tiny mechanical snap of it. Then I began to write. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Not to summon anything, not to document a haunting for someone else's entertainment, to take ownership of the narrative, to put my version of events on paper before any system could file it away or edit it into something convenient. I wrote the calm beginning, the first wrong receipt, the tape, the manager's rules, Elias's tired eyes and the shadow behind him, the way the motel tried to make participation feel like politeness, the way refusing to be named had worked better than violence ever could. As I wrote, the house remained quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The HVAC cycled. No further beep came. No paper whispered again. The absence didn't feel like victory. It felt like a test unanswered. A hook left without a bite. When I finished the last paragraph, my hand cramped slightly. I shook it out and stared at the page, at the lines of ink that made the night real, in a way it couldn't be erased by daylight embarrassment. I realized then what the motel had taught me, and what it hadn't been able to take. Fear doesn't win by force, not the enduring kind. It wins by participation, by getting you to respond, to accept the prompt, to complete the form, to make yourself legible to whatever wants to own you. I closed the notebook and let the lamp's warmth sit on my skin for a moment longer than necessary. Then I looked at the dark hallway beyond my bedroom door, not with bravado, not with denial, but with a steady refusal to be rushed. And before I went back to sleep, I left myself, and you, one question to hold, the way you hold a small stone in your pocket and feel it there when you need reminding. If something from your past printed your name and asked you to sign, would you read it, or would you let it burn unread? This story isn't only about a haunted motel. It's about how easily a system can turn a person into a line item. How fear grows when we respond on autopilot, when we sign for things we don't fully understand. The real victory wasn't destroying a room. It was choosing non-consent, refusing to be named, processed, and owned by a ritual disguised as procedure. In a quieter way, that's a life skill. We can't control every dark hallway, but we can control our boundaries, what we read, what we agree to, what we carry forward. Sometimes healing looks like stepping out of a loop and writing your own version before someone else files it away. Audience question. What's one receipt from your past you no longer want to keep paying for? And what boundary could you set tonight?